Hello everyone. If you like this audiobook and want to listen to more, please consider subscribing. And if you like this video, like it as well, that it enjoy.
The road to the sea. The morning air of Winterfell was bitingly cold. A thin layer of frost clung to the gray granite of the courtyard, glistening in the pale, pre-dawn light. The main host of the northern army had just marched out of the gates, their heavy boots and wagon wheels leaving a churned, muddy wake on the dirt paths that fed into the new concrete Kingsroad. Ned Stark had remained behind. A Lord Paramount belonged at the head of his army, but a father needed to bid farewell to his family. Now, clad in his heavy plate armor, a cloak of dark gray wool trimmed with winter wolf fur resting heavy on his shoulders, Ned stood in the center of the yard. His black destrier, fully barded and breathing plumes of white steam, was held ready by a stableboy. But Ned was not looking at the gate. He was looking at the small assembly gathered on the steps of the great keep. His family. He walked toward them, the steel plates of his sabatons clanking rhythmically against the stone. He stopped first in front of Cregan. The 7-year-old boy stood unnaturally still. He wore a scaled-down version of a Stark tunic, his dark hair messy from sleep, his gray eyes wide and uncharacteristically solemn. He knew what a marching army meant. Ned dropped to one knee, the metal of his armor grinding, bringing himself to eye level with his heir. He placed his heavy, gauntleted hands on the boy's small shoulders. "You look serious today, Cregan," Ned said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "You're leaving," Cregan said, his lower lip trembling just a fraction before he bit down on it, trying to embody the stoicism he thought a lord required. "To fight the squids." "I am," Ned confirmed gently. "The king has called, and the North must answer. But I leave a very important task to you." Cregan's eyes widened. "To me?" "Yes," Ned said, his expression turning grave and entirely earnest. "I am taking the army. But an empty castle is a dangerous thing. You are the oldest Stark male remaining within these walls. Do you know what that means?" Cregan swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "There must always be a Stark in Winterfell." "Exactly," Ned said, tapping the boy's chest, right over his heart. "You are the Stark in Winterfell now, Cregan. You are the lord of this keep until I return. You protect your mother. You protect your brother and Rhaenys. You look after the people." Cregan straightened his spine, puffing out his chest, the weight of the 8,000-year-old legacy settling onto his young shoulders. "I will, father. I won't let anyone pass the gates." "I know you won't," Ned smiled, a genuine, warm expression. "But being a lord isn't just about standing guard. You have duties. You must listen to Maester Luwin. And, above all, you must never skip your training. When I return, I expect your footwork to be flawless." "I'll practice every day," Cregan promised, a hint of his usual enthusiastic grin breaking through the solemnity. "I'll be so fast you won't even see my wooden sword." "I look forward to it," Ned chuckled, pulling the boy into a tight, brief embrace. He stood up and moved down the line to where Jon and Rhaenys stood. Rhaenys, at 9, was a fierce, bright spark in the dreary northern morning. She stood with her arms crossed, her dark eyes flashing with an indignant fire. She hated being left behind. Jon, 6 years old and extremely quiet, stood beside her, observing the farewells with a silent, brooding intensity that was startling for a child his age. He rarely spoke his thoughts, but when he did, they possessed a chilling clarity. "Rhaenys," Ned said, looking down at the fierce young princess. "Keep your chin up. A lady of your station does not scowl at a departing army." "I am not a lady, Uncle Ned," Rhaenys retorted instantly. "Anna says I am a warrior. I should be riding with you. I could throw axes from the ships." Ned couldn't help but smile at the influence Lyanna had successfully imparted. "One day, perhaps, but for now, your battlefield is the training yard. I need you here." He looked between her and Jon. "Listen to your mothers. Listen to Ashara and Elia. They rule the household in my absence." "And Jon?" Jon looked up, his beautiful, ethereal features catching the morning light. "Yes, father," he asked softly. "Watch over your brother," Ned said, recognizing the quiet intellect that burned behind the boy's eyes. "Cregan has the heart of a lord, but you have the mind of a strategist. Help him." Jon gave a single, slow nod. "I will. The squids are foolish to attack your ships. They will sink." "Let us hope so," Ned agreed. He placed a hand on each of their heads. "Never skip your training. Uncle Arthur will drill you every morning. I expect you both to give him no peace." "We'll wear him out," Rhaenys promised fiercely. Ned stepped past them, his gaze falling upon Arthur Dayne. The Sword of the Morning wore a simple gray cloak over unadorned mail, leaning casually against a stone pillar. He did not look like a Kingsguard, but he radiated an aura of lethal competence that made the air around him feel heavy. Ned didn't need to give him a speech. They shared a look, a silent communication forged in the blood of the Tower of Joy and years of quiet, shared duty. "Protect them, Arthur," Ned said quietly. "With my last breath, Ned," Arthur replied, his violet eyes unwavering. "If the Ironborn come to the gates, I could use the exercise." Ned nodded, knowing the castle was more secure with one Arthur Dane than with 1,000 common spearmen. He turned his attention to Elia Martell. The Princess of Dornay was wrapped in thick furs, holding little Sansa in her arms. At 3 years old, Sansa was a striking blend of north and south, dark hair like her father, but bright, startling violet eyes inherited from Ashara. She was currently fascinated by the shiny silver clasps on Ned's armor, reaching out with tiny, mittened hands to bat at them. "Take care of yourself, Elia," Ned told her, his voice respectful and warm. "The winter winds are picking up. Do not linger on the battlements." "I am a creature of the sun, Lord Stark," Elia smiled faintly. "I intend to stay close to the hearth. Go with the gods. May they bring you swift victory." Ned reached out and gently took Sansa's small hand, kissing her knuckles, and then leaned in to press a kiss to her forehead. "Be good for your mother and Aunt Elia," he whispered to the toddler. Sansa merely giggled, grabbing his beard. Finally, Ned turned to Ashara. She stood slightly apart from the others, a vision of dark hair and violet eyes against the gray stone. She wore a heavy cloak of deep purple wool, and resting on her hip was a squirming, 1.5-year-old girl with dark, unruly hair, Arya Stark. The cloak could not hide the pronounced, rounded swell of Ashara's belly beneath the toddler. She was 7 moons pregnant, carrying their 4th child, and the radiant flush of impending motherhood warred with the anxiety tight in her jaw. Ned stepped close, wrapping his armored arms around her as best he could, mindful not to crush her little Arya, who immediately reached out to pat the cold steel of his breastplate. Ashara leaned her head against him, her free hand coming up to grip his shoulder tightly. He could feel the slight tremor in her fingers. "I hate this," Ashara whispered into the cold steel. "I know," Ned murmured, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of lemons that somehow always managed to overpower the smell of snow. "I will never forgive Balon Greyjoy for this. For making me ride away from you when the baby is so close." "He is a fool," Ashara agreed, her voice thick with unshed tears. She pulled back slightly, looking up into his gray eyes. "He chose the wrong time to wake the wolf. Make him pay for it, Ned. But do not be reckless. You are a father now. 4 times over, soon. I need you to return to me. You should worry about my enemies, my love," Ned said, a small, dangerous smile touching the corners of his mouth. Ashara let out a wet laugh, shaking her head. "I pity them, truly, but I worry for you all the same. I will be back before the new child takes its first steps," Ned promised. He kissed her deeply, a lingering press of lips that spoke of years of devotion and the desperate hope of return. He then planted a quick kiss on Arya's nose, making the toddler giggle and squirm. He broke the embrace reluctantly. He looked at his family one last time, the pack he had built, the future he was fighting to protect. "Stay safe," Ned commanded them all. He turned on his heel, the heavy cloak swirling behind him, and walked to his waiting destrier. He vaulted into the saddle with practiced ease, gathering the reins. He gave one final nod to the assembly on the steps, wheeled the massive horse around, and spurred it toward the hunter's gate. As he rode out into the wolfswood, the heavy iron portcullis slammed shut behind him with a loud thud. The time for family was over. The time for war had begun. The treeline broke, revealing the vast, churning expanse of the sunset sea. The sky was the color of bruised iron, the water a frothing, angry gray. And standing defiantly against the crashing waves was Sea Dragon Point. When Ned had first proposed the project to his bannermen, it had been a wild, empty peninsula of jagged cliffs and deep coves, haunted by the ruins of the first men. Now, it was a marvel of modern northern engineering. A massive, star-shaped fortress of dark basalt and concrete dominated the highest cliff, its high watchtowers offering a commanding view of the horizon. Thick curtain walls snaked down the slopes to embrace the natural harbor below. But it was the harbor itself that stole the breath. It was packed. The docks, constructed of thick, treated timber, extended far into the deep water. And moored alongside them, bobbing gently in the swells, were the Leviathans. 50 northern carracks. They were terrifying to behold. High-walled, broad-beamed, and painted in dark, menacing colors. Their triangular lateen sails were furled tightly against the yards, but their decks bristled with weaponry. Heavy iron scorpions were mounted on the high forecastles and stern castles, their deadly bolts loaded and ready. Ned rode down the switchback road toward the port city that had sprung up around the docks. The air was filled with the sounds of industry, hammers striking wood, the shouts of harbormasters, the screeching of gulls. A contingent of riders spurred out from the main gates of the lower keep to meet him. At their head rode a familiar figure, clad in sea otter fur and a doublet of stark blue and white. Benjen Stark had grown fully into his lordship. He looked weathered by the sea air, his jaw square, his gray eyes sharp and assessing. "Ned," Benjen called out, reining in his horse and offering a broad, relieved grin. "You made incredible time. I expected you to be slogging through the Wolfswood for another week at least." "The roads, Ben," Ned smiled, clasping his brother's forearm tightly as their horses drew level. "They work better than I ever hoped." "They do," Benjen agreed, looking past Ned at the endless stream of soldiers pouring down the road. "The entire North, delivered to my doorstep in a fortnight. It's a terrifying sight." "It's meant to be," Ned said, his eyes drifting out to the fleet. "The ships look ready." "They are," Benjen said proudly. "Fully provisioned, armed, and crewed. We've been running drills in the bay for weeks. The Marines are itching for a fight." Ned dismounted, handing the reins of his destrier to a waiting squire. He wanted to walk, to feel the ground of this new city beneath his boots. Benjen dismounted as well, falling into step beside his older brother as they walked toward the bustling docks. "You've built something magnificent here, Benjen," Ned praised, looking at the sturdy stone warehouses and the well-ordered streets. "Sea Dragon Point is a true jewel of the West." Benjen sighed heavily, a scowl suddenly replacing his grin. "It is a jewel that is currently lacking a lady, thanks to that absolute idiot sitting on Pike." Ned chuckled. "Ah, I take it Daisy is not pleased." "Not pleased," Benjen groaned, rubbing his face with a gloved hand. "Ned, she is apoplectic. She had the dress fitted. We had the feast planned. Lord Gior had shipped 50 casks of ale from Bear Island. We were 2 days away from saying our vows before the heart tree when the raven arrived about Lannisport burning." Benjen kicked a loose pebble on the cobblestones. "Balin Greyjoy picked a hell of a time for a rebellion. Right as I was about to be married, he had to go and rebel. Now the wedding is on hold, the ale is sitting in the cellars, and Daisy." Benjen shuddered visibly. "Daisy has been terrifying." "I am right here, Benjen," a harsh voice interrupted. As Ned and Benjen walked toward the flagship, a tall, imposing woman in boiled leather and ringmail strode down the gangplank. Daisy Mormont carried a wicked-looking iron mace resting on her shoulder. She moved with purpose, her dark hair braided tight against her scalp. She stopped in front of them, offering a brief, respectful nod to Ned. "Lord Stark." "Lady Daisy," Ned greeted her. "Balin Greyjoy owes me a wedding feast, Lord Stark," Daisy declared, hefting the mace. "I intend to collect it from his skull. I want a spot in the vanguard." Benjen looked at Ned, his expression a mix of terror and adoration. "You don't want an angry Mormont woman on the sidelines, Ben," Ned laughed, clapping his brother on the shoulder. "They are known to bite." "I know," Benjen exclaimed. Ned smiled softly. "Save your wrath for the Ironborn, Daisy. Don't worry about the delays. We will have you both married right here at Sea Dragon Point the moment this rebellion is finished. It will be the greatest celebration the West has ever seen." Daisy's posture relaxed slightly. She nodded. "I accept that, assuming there is enough of Pike left standing for us to celebrate." They reached the edge of the main pier. The flagship of the Western Fleet, a massive carrack named the Winter's Wrath, loomed over them. Sailors were rushing across its decks, securing riggings and checking the massive iron bolts stacked near the scorpions. "The ships are ready to sail, Ned," Benjen reported, his tone shifting back to that of a naval commander. "Lord Jorah Mormont has command of the vanguard. The tides will be in our favor by mid-morning tomorrow. The men are rested, and the wind is blowing west." Ned looked out at the churning gray waters of the Sunset Sea. He could feel the anticipation humming in the air, a collective holding of breath by thousands of men preparing to step into the unknown. He reached out with the force, sensing the raw, aggressive energy of his army settling into the camps around the city. They were strong. They were fast. They were furious. "Let the army rest for the night," Ned commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of the Warden of the North. "Feed them well. Give them a ration of ale, but no spirits. I want clear heads." He turned to Benjen and Daisy, his gray eyes reflecting the cold, hard steel of the sea. Tomorrow morning, we board the ships, Ned said softly. Tomorrow morning, we start sailing. And we show the Iron Islands what happens when you wake the dragon of the sea. 29 comments 0 vote. The pincer at Fair Isle. The sea off the coast of Fair Isle was a turbulent expanse of steel-gray waves, churned into a frothing frenzy by the oars of 100 dying ships. Stannis Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End and Master of Ships, stood on the quarterdeck of the Fury. His jaw was set so tightly that the grinding of his teeth was audible over the roar of the ocean. He was the anvil of the Royal Vanguard, and his forces were taking a terrible pounding. The Iron Fleet, commanded by the fearsome Victarion Greyjoy, had sailed into the straits exactly as Stannis had calculated. The Ironborn, arrogant and hungry for the wealth of the Westerlands and the Reach, had seen the royal fleet guarding the channel and charged headlong. They were eager for the close quarters boarding actions and deck brawls they excelled at. Stannis had arrayed his war galleys in a tight crescent formation, denying the swift, shallow-drafted longships the room they needed to flank his line. It was a disciplined, methodical defense, but the sheer ferocity of the Ironborn was taking a heavy toll. Grappling hooks flew through the air in dense, deadly swarms, biting deep into the wooden rails of the royal galleys. Men screamed as they were pulled into the freezing depths, dragged down by the weight of their own chainmail and armor. "Hold the line," Stannis barked to his signalman, his voice devoid of panic, resonating with cold authority. "Tell the Sea Dragon to close the gap on the left. Do not let them break the crescent." A few hundred yards away, amidst the chaos of burning pitch and splintering oars, King Robert Baratheon was in his element. He had insisted on commanding the vanguard galley. Robert was not a sailor, but once the ships locked together, the wooden deck became a battlefield, and there was no greater warrior on a battlefield than the demon of the trident. Through the smoke and the sea spray, Stannis could see his older brother. Robert, wielding a massive, blood-slick warhammer, was clearing the deck of an Ironborn longship single-handedly. He let out a booming, terrifying laugh as he smashed a reaver over the side, his antlered helm glinting in the pale sunlight. But bravery alone could not win a naval war. Victarion Greyjoy's flagship, the Iron Victory, a massive longship bristling with heavily armored reavers, was carving a path straight toward the center of the royal formation. Victarion himself, clad in heavy plate armor layered with a kraken-shaped helm, stood at the prow, wielding a wicked battle-axe. He was a brute, a force of raw destruction, and he was slowly breaking Stannis's line. "My lord," the captain of the Fury shouted, pointing a trembling finger toward the northern horizon. "Look." Stannis turned his cold blue eyes to the north. The wind had shifted, blowing strong and steady from the sunset sea. Riding that wind was a sight the Ironborn had never anticipated, and one that left the master of ships in a state of absolute, silent shock. Stannis Baratheon knew every class of warship in the known world. He knew the sleek Bravo Sea runners, the heavy swan ships of the Summer Isles, and the massive, cumbersome galleys of the Arbor. The ships bearing down from the north were none of those. They were mountains of dark timber, riding incredibly high and proud above the whitecaps. They did not rely on banks of oars dipping into the water. Instead, they featured massive, triangular lateen sails. Stannis gripped the rail of the Fury, his tactical mind racing. The wind was blowing from the northwest. Traditional square-rigged galleys and longships could only sail with the wind behind them. But these northern ships, they were cutting across the wind. The triangular sails allowed them to tack at sharp angles, harnessing the gale with explosive, terrifying efficiency. It was a technological leap that rendered the traditional Westerosi fleets instantly obsolete. 50 northern carracks, the western fleet of House Stark. Eddard Stark stood on the high forecastle of the flagship, the Winter's Wrath. The wind whipped his dark gray cloak around him, but he stood perfectly still. He closed his eyes, extending his consciousness outward. The force sense spread across the water, cutting through the visual noise of the smoke and the waves. He felt the chaotic, desperate struggle of the royal fleet to the south. He felt the bloodlust and blind aggression of the Ironborn in the center. "Perfect," Ned murmured. The timing was flawless. "Lord Stark," Jorah Mormont called out from the helm, his voice rough with excitement. "We have the wind. The Iron Fleet is fully committed to the straits. They cannot turn." "Close the jaw, Jorah," Ned commanded, his voice amplified by a subtle push of the force, reaching every officer on the deck. "Signal the fleet. Pincer formation. We do not board, we crush." A deep, resonant blast from a mammoth horn echoed from the Winter's Wrath, immediately answered by 49 other horns across the northern line. The carracks accelerated. With their deep keels and lateen sails, They cut through the rough waters of the Sunset Sea with a speed and stability that rowed galleys could never achieve. They bore down on the exposed rear of the Iron Fleet with devastating speed. The Ironborn at the rear of the formation realized the danger too late. Men shouted in terror, pointing at the towering wooden fortresses bearing down on them. The longships tried to turn, their oars clashing and tangling in the confined space of the straits, but there was nowhere to go. They were trapped between Stannis Baratheon's iron anvil and Eddard Stark's monstrous hammer. Scorpions! Fire! Ned shouted. The high decks of the Carracks erupted in a chorus of heavy, metallic thwacks. Massive iron bolts streaked through the air. They did not just hit the Ironborn ships, they obliterated them. The bolts punched through the thin, clinker-built hulls of the longships with terrifying ease, shattering oars, impaling men, and letting the freezing sea rush into the holds. And then came the physical impact. The Winter's Wrath slammed into the rearguard flagship of the Ironborn left flank. The Carracks reinforced, iron-capped prow sheared straight through the center of the longship. The sound of rending timber was deafening. The longship snapped in half, its crew screaming as they were tossed into the churning water. The Carrack did not even slow down, its massive displacement simply plowing over the wreckage. Across the line, the scene repeated itself. The heavy northern ships crushed the pride of the Iron Islands under their keels. While the Western Fleet executed a textbook naval massacre, Ned Stark's mind was elsewhere. He had not come to Fair Isle just to win a battle. He had come to eliminate a future threat at its root. Victarion was a brute, Balin was a fool, but Euron Greyjoy was a danger to the entire world. Left alive, Euron would be exiled, travel the world, learn dark sorcery, and return to Westeros bringing ruin and dark magic to their shores. Ned closed his eyes, tuning out the screams of the drowning Ironborn and the crunch of shattering wood. He sought a specific signature in the Force. He bypassed the mundane anger and fear of the common sailors. He looked for a dark, twisted void of psychopathy and malice. He found it. It was slipping away, on the far eastern edge of the battle, hugging the treacherous, jagged reefs that the heavier galleys and Carracks dared not approach. A single ship was cutting through the water with unnatural silence. It was a longship, painted the color of dried blood, and its single, large square sail was completely black. The silence. Euron Greyjoy, seeing the trap close, was abandoning his family and his fleet, slipping away into the shadows to save his own skin. Ned's eyes snapped open. He pointed a gauntleted finger toward the red hull slipping through the mist. "Captain," Ned shouted, "bring us about, hard to port. That red ship with the black sails, intercept it." The ship's captain, a seasoned Manderley mariner, looked at the trajectory. "My lord, that puts us dangerously close to the eastern reefs. Our draft is too deep. We will tear the bottom out of the ship." "I will guide us," Ned stated, his voice brooking no argument. "Do not slow down. Full sail. Ram that vessel." The captain swallowed hard but roared the orders. The Winter's Wrath heeled hard, its massive timbers groaning as it broke away from the main line of slaughter and angled toward the rocky shallows. Ned moved to the very tip of the prow. He reached out with the force, extending his awareness beneath the churning waves. He felt the jagged coral heads, the submerged rocks, the deadly traps of the shoreline. "Port 3 degrees," Ned yelled back to the helmsman. "Hold, now starboard." He navigated the massive Carrack through a minefield of unseen stone, using his preternatural senses to thread a path that would have sunk any normal captain. Euron Greyjoy, standing at the tiller of the Silence, looked back. His eyes widened in genuine surprise as he saw the towering northern warship cutting through the reefs, gaining on him with impossible speed. The Silence was fast, but the wind was howling directly behind the Winter's Wrath, filling the lateen sails to their bursting point. The gap closed rapidly. 200 yards. 100. "Scorpions," Ned ordered. "Aim for the mast. Bring it down." The heavy ballistae on the forecastle snapped. 2 bolts went wide, splashing harmlessly into the sea. The third, guided by a subtle, telekinetic nudge from Ned, struck true. It hit the thick wooden mast of the Silence dead center, splintering the timber. With a sickening crack, the black sail collapsed, the mast toppling over the side and dragging heavily in the water. The Silence jerked to a halt, crippled. "Prepare to board," Ned roared. Grappling lines. The Winter's Wrath loomed over the crippled longship. The massive hull scraped against the side of the Silence, showering the deck with splinters. Iron hooks flew from the Carrack, biting deep into the red wood, locking the two ships together in a death embrace. Ned did not wait for the boarding planks. Clad in his heavy gray plate armor, a wolfskin cloak billowing behind him, he leapt from the high rail of the carrack. The distance was over 15 feet down to the deck of the Silence. Ned used the force to cushion his fall, landing on the blood-red deck with a heavy, metallic thud that cracked the floorboards beneath his boots, but left him entirely unharmed. Behind him, dozens of Northern Marines began to swing down on ropes, shouting their battle cries. But on the Silence, there were no battle cries in response. The crew of Euron's ship did not shout. They did not scream. They were mutes, their tongues ripped out by their sadistic captain. They fought with an eerie, terrifying silence, their faces twisted into masks of desperate malice. A dozen mutes swarmed Ned the moment he landed, wielding jagged axes and curved SOC blades. They fought with an unnatural detachment, seemingly impervious to pain or fear. Ned reached over his shoulder and gripped the hilt protruding from his back scabbard. He drew ice. The ancestral Valyrian steel greatsword was traditionally an executioner's blade, deemed far too massive and unwieldy for the tight, chaotic quarters of a ship's deck. A normal man would catch the 6-foot blade in the rigging or the rails. But with the force flowing through his veins, amplifying his strength tenfold, the dark, smoky steel felt completely weightless in his hands. He stepped forward. A mute lunged with a spear. Ned pivoted on his heel, letting the spear pass harmlessly by, and in the same fluid motion, brought the greatsword around in a tight, horizontal arc. The Valyrian steel sheared through the wooden spear shaft, the man's chainmail, and his torso with zero resistance. Two more rushed him from the sides. Ned stepped inside their guard. He drove his armored elbow into the face of the man on his left, shattering his jaw, while simultaneously bringing ice up in a brutal, diagonal slash. The dark steel cleaved entirely through the second attacker's ironbound shield and the collarbone beneath it. He did not pause. He did not break stride. He walked straight down the center of the deck, moving toward the quarterdeck. Every time a mute stepped into his path, they died. A single swing, a parry and a thrust. An economy of motion that was brutal, efficient, and utterly unstoppable. He swung the massive greatsword with the speed of a rapier, effortlessly striking down the armed men in his path. The eerie silence of the mutes was broken only by the wet thud of falling bodies and the sharp ringing of Valyrian steel parting lesser metal. He reached the steps leading to the raised quarterdeck at the stern. Standing there, flanked by two massive, heavily scarred mutes, was Euron Greyjoy. He wore armor of dark, scaled leather, a kraken embroidered in gold thread upon his breast. His dark hair blew wildly in the wind. He had pale, flawless skin and lips that were tinted a faint blue. He did not look afraid. He looked thoroughly amused. "Eddard Stark," Euron called out, his voice smooth and mocking. "I must say, you make quite an entrance. You ruined a perfectly good mast." Ned stopped at the base of the stairs. He looked up at the crow's eye. He felt the cold, oily sickness of Euron's presence in the force. There was no redeeming quality here. Just a dark void. "Did you come to die here today, Stark?" Euron asked, his lecherous smile widening, revealing perfectly white teeth. He drew his blade from his hip. "Because I can assure you, the drowned god is very hungry." Ned did not answer. He had no intention of talking to the pirate. He walked up the stairs. The two massive mutes lunged forward to protect their captain. Ned fed a burst of force speed into his legs. He blurred forward. Before the mute on the left could swing his heavy maul, Ned's greatsword flashed, severing the man's hands at the wrists. He kicked the man viciously in the chest, sending him tumbling backward. The second mute raised a thick iron broadsword, but Ned brought ice down with overwhelming force, shearing straight through the iron blade and the man holding it. In 2 seconds, Euron's guards were dead. Euron's smile faltered. The amusement vanished from his blue eyes, replaced by a sudden, sharp realization. Euron slashed wildly, aiming a blindingly fast strike at Ned's neck. Ned stepped into the strike. He brought ice up in a harsh, ringing parry. The two blades clashed. Euron expected the heavy impact to stagger the Northern Lord. Instead, there was a deafening, ringing chime that echoed across the deck. Ned pushed his force energy entirely into his stance and his grip. The dark, smoky blade of ice held perfectly firm, absorbing the entire kinetic force of the blow without yielding a single inch. A shockwave traveled up Euron's arm, numbing his fingers. Using the locked blades as a pivot point, Ned twisted his body, stepping entirely inside Euron's guard. With his free, armored left hand, he delivered a crushing, force-enhanced palm strike directly into Euron's sternum. The blow caved in the dark leather armor and shattered Euron's ribs. The breath left the pirate's lungs in a violent rush. He staggered backward, his grip on his stolen sword failing entirely, the curved blade clattering onto the wooden deck. Ned did not let him recover. He spun, generating massive momentum, and brought ice around in a flat, perfect, horizontal sweep. The heavy steel bit into the side of Euron Greyjoy's neck. It sheared through muscle, through the spine, and out the other side. Euron's head spun into the air. The head hit the deck and rolled into the scuppers. The lecherous smile was permanently frozen on his lips, locked in a state of eternal, shocked arrogance. His headless body stood for a moment, blood pouring from the stump, before collapsing heavily onto the wooden planks. Ned lowered his greatsword. He turned and looked down at the main deck. The Northern Marines had made short work of the remaining mutes. The silence was secured. Ned walked to the rail of the captured ship and looked back toward the straits. The battle was over. The trap had worked flawlessly. The Iron Fleet was a floating graveyard of shattered timber and burning pitch. The pincer movement had crushed them entirely. Stannis's galleys had held the line, and the northern carracks had ground the longships to matchwood from behind. In the center of the devastation, Ned saw the Stag's Fury grappled to the ruined husk of the Iron Victory. King Robert Baratheon was standing on the rail of the Ironborn flagship, holding his bloody warhammer high above his head. At his feet lay the battered, Covedon corpse of Victarion Greyjoy. Robert let out a roar of absolute triumph that carried across the water, echoing off the cliffs of Fair Isle. 2 hours later, the surviving ships of the combined fleets limped into the small, sheltered harbor of Fair Isle. The usually pristine beaches of the island were littered with wreckage and the detritus of war. Ned walked down the gangplank of the Winter's Wrath. He wiped the blood from ice with a rag before sliding the massive blade back into its scabbard, his gray cloak heavy with salt spray. From down the pier, a massive figure pushed through the crowd of cheering sailors and weary soldiers. Robert Baratheon was covered from head to toe in gore. His black hair was matted to his forehead, his antlered helm was missing half a horn, and his heavy plate armor was deeply dented in 3 places. But his face was split in a wide grin. "Ned," Robert bellowed, his voice hoarse from screaming. Robert threw his massive arms around the Lord of Winterfell. He picked Ned completely off his feet, crushing him in a bear hug that smelled of blood, sweat, and seawater. "You glorious, frozen bastard." Robert laughed, setting Ned down and shaking him by the shoulders. "Did you see it? Did you see the look on the squid's faces when your floating castles appeared behind them? By the gods, it was beautiful. It was effective." Ned smiled, returning the embrace firmly. "You look terrible, Robert." "I feel magnificent," Robert roared, slapping his own armored chest. "I caved in Victarion's breastplate." The big brute thought his armor made him invincible. He forgot about the hammer. Stannis Baratheon walked up behind the king. Stannis looked closely at Ned, his eyes analyzing the Northern Lord with a new, intense respect. "A perfectly executed maneuver, Lord Stark," Stannis said tightly. "Your arrival was timely. And your ships, they sail into the wind. I have never seen such a design. We build for efficiency in the north, Lord Stannis," Ned said respectfully, bowing his head to the master of ships. "And your line held perfectly. Without your anvil, our hammer would have struck nothing but water." Stannis gave a short, stiff nod of acknowledgement. "The Iron Fleet is at the bottom of the sea," Robert declared, throwing an arm around Ned's shoulders and turning him toward the island's keep. "Balon Greyjoy has nothing left but a damp rock and a bad attitude. We sail for Pike tomorrow, Ned. We're going to knock his miserable castle into the sea." Ned looked back at the captured red hull of the Silence bobbing in the harbor. The immediate threat was gone. The dark magic was stopped before it could begin. "We will, Robert," Ned said. "But tonight, we rest and tend to the wounded. And we drink," Robert cheered, steering them toward the nearest tavern on the island. 76 comments 0 vote. Fair Isle. Fair Isle had been transformed. The picturesque beaches and rolling green hills were now buried under a sprawling canvas city. Tents of every color and size stretched from the rocky western cliffs down to the sheltered eastern harbor, housing the thousands of men who had just broken the Iron Fleet. Campfires dotted the landscape, casting a flickering, orange glow against the night sky. In the center of the encampment stood the royal pavilion. It was massive, constructed of heavy yellow and black canvas, bearing the crowned stag of House Baratheon. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of roasted meat, sweat, and spilled wine. The war council had just concluded. The various lords and captains of the vanguard had filtered out into the night, returning to their own tents to celebrate their survival and their victory. Jon Arryn, the Hand of the King, was not present. He was currently marching down the ocean road with the rest of the royal host, expected to arrive at Lannisport and cross over to the island in a few days. It had been decided during the council that the combined vanguard would halt their advance here. They would wait on Fair Isle until Jon Arryn, Tywin Lannister, Hoster Tully, and Mace Tyrell arrived with the bulk of the southern armies. Ned Stark sat in a heavy wooden chair across from the king. He was entirely satisfied with the council's decision. In the original timeline, Ned knew the Northmen had taken the brunt of the casualties in the sieges of the Iron Islands. Not this time. Ned had brought his fleet and his elite guard to crush the Greyjoy navy and eliminate Euron. He had done his part. He had no intention of throwing northern lives against the high stone walls of Pike while the Lannisters and Tyrells marched in late to claim the glory and the spoils. Let Tywin's Westermen catch an axe to the face for once. Let Mace Tyrell's knights wade through the mud. Finally, Robert Baratheon groaned, reaching across the heavy oak table and grabbing a square bottle of clear liquid. I thought Manderley was never going to stop talking about provisioning the fleet and counting grain sacks. The man loves the sound of his own voice. He loves his ledgers, Ned corrected calmly, watching Robert pour 2 very generous measures of winter's breath into ornate silver goblets. And right now, those ledgers are keeping your army fed. Aye, Robert grunted, sliding a goblet across the table to Ned. Drink up, we earned it today. Robert looked terrible, but happy. He was still covered in bruises and small cuts from the deck fighting, and he moved with a slight stiffness, but his eyes were bright. The dark humors that usually clung to him in King's Landing had vanished, washed away by the adrenaline of battle. Robert took a large gulp of the vodka, wincing slightly at the burn before sighing in satisfaction. So, Robert said, wiping his beard with the back of his hand. We wait for the old men and the fat flowers to arrive. A few days of rest. I can live with that. How are things in the frozen wastes, Ned? How is Ashara, and the pups? They are well, Ned said, a genuine warmth entering his voice at the mention of his family. Cregan is practically running the castle. Jon and Rhaenys keep him out of too much trouble. Sansa and Arya are growing fast. And Ashara, Ned smiled, she is going to give birth to another baby in 2 moons. Robert froze, his goblet halfway to his mouth. He lowered it, his blue eyes widening. Then, a booming, raucous laugh exploded from his chest, so loud it shook the canvas walls of the pavilion. 5, Robert roared, spilling wine as he slapped his hand on the heavy oak table. Gods, Ned, 5 pups already, the whole realm thinks you're up there building stone roads and freezing your stones off. Meanwhile, you're breeding an entire army in your bedchamber. The horny wolf, they should call you. Winter is coming, Robert, Ned said dryly, taking a sip of his drink. I need hands to shovel the snow. Robert chuckled, shaking his head in deep amusement. Ashara is a saint for putting up with you. 5 children, good for you, Ned. Truly. Ned watched the humor slowly fade from Robert's eyes, replaced by a familiar, heavy shadow. In your family, Ned asked quietly, how are Cersei and the boy? Robert's face darkened instantly. He let out a low, bitter grumble, reaching for the bottle to refill his cup. Cersei, Robert spat the name. She is a Lannister to the bone. Cold, proud, and completely insufferable. She complains about the smell of the city, she complains about my drinking, she complains about the hunting. He took a heavy drink. And she smothers the kid a bit too much. Joffrey, Ned asked. Aye, Joffrey, Robert said, his tone devoid of any paternal warmth. He's just a boy, but she treats him like he's made of spun glass. If he gets a scratch, she demands the heads of the servants. She's making him soft, Ned. A king can't be soft. He cries over a splinter. Robert stared into his cup, his brow furrowed in deep frustration. And now she's expecting another one, Robert added, his voice flat. Any day now. She's completely insufferable when she's with child. Keeps to her quarters, surrounds herself with those redcloak guards her father gave her. It doesn't even feel like my own keep. Ned remained silent. He knew exactly what Cersei was doing, but he didn't know who fathered the children, but this was not the time or the place to tear the realm apart. He needed Robert focused on the Ironborn. I miss it, Ned, Robert said suddenly. His voice lost its anger, dropping into a rare, quiet vulnerability. Miss what? The Vale, Robert said, looking up, his eyes glassy with nostalgia. I miss our boyhood, the Eyrie, riding through the mountains of the moon, hunting with Jon Arryn before he was the Hand, back when he was just an old man trying to keep us from breaking our necks. Robert leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with his large hands. I hate King's Landing, Ned. It is a foul pit. A gilded cage full of vipers and flatterers. Everyone who looks at me wants something. A title, a coin, a piece of land, a marriage pact. They smile at me, they pour my wine, and they scheme behind my back. Robert dropped his hands, looking directly at Ned. They think I don't know, Robert said, his voice surprisingly sharp. They think I'm just a drunken fool who only wants to hunt and whore. My wife thinks I'm a lackwit. Her father thinks I'm a useful brute. Varys thinks I'm a blind man. Robert leaned forward, pointing a thick finger at the table. But I know, Ned. I know exactly what everyone wants from me. I see the greed in their eyes. I just let it be. I let them think I'm a fool because it's easier. I do what I want. I drink, I ride, I fight when someone gives me an excuse. And I let John Arryn take care of the rest. He wanted the peace. He can manage the vultures. Ned looked at his friend. It was a tragic admission. Robert wasn't blind to the corruption of his court, he was just entirely defeated by it. He had won the throne to avenge a woman he loved, and now he was stuck sitting on it, surrounded by people he despised. You are the king, Robert, Ned said softly. You have the power to change the court. Send them away. Bring in honest men. There are no honest men in the South, Ned, Robert laughed bitterly. Only you. And you ran back to the snow the first chance you got. Don't blame you. I would have run too. Robert grabbed the square bottle of vodka again. He didn't bother with the goblet this time. He uncorked it and took a long, sustained gulp directly from the glass. He slammed it down, wiping his mouth, his face flushed. Gods, this is good, Robert sighed, his mood shifting rapidly back to boisterous appreciation. I have to thank you for this, Ned. This drink, it's the only good thing in my life some days. He tapped the thick glass bottle. I wouldn't pass a day without drinking it now. Your whiskey, your brandy, your vodka. They are magnificent. The arbor can keep their sour grapes. I drink at least one of your northern spirits every single day. It burns the rot right out of my stomach. Ned allowed a small, dry smile to touch his lips. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. Robert, Ned deadpanned. You wouldn't pass a day without drinking, regardless. If I handed you a puddle of fermented swamp water from the neck, you'd find an excuse to toast with it. Robert paused, looking offended for exactly 1 second before letting out a booming laugh. You're entirely right, Robert agreed loudly, but at least your swamp water tastes like fire. He grabbed the bottle again. To the north, Robert toasted to the empty tent, raising the bottle high. And to the wolves who know how to brew. To the king, Ned replied politely, raising his silver goblet and taking a small sip. They sat together for hours. The conversation drifted away from the heavy burdens of the crown and the dark secrets of the court. They talked about the melee at Harrenhal, about the girls they had chased in Gulltown, and about the time Robert had gotten his horse stuck in a mud pit near the Bloody Gate. Robert drank with a relentless, punishing pace. He finished the vodka and moved on to a cask of heavy stout a servant had left in the corner. He grew louder, his stories more exaggerated, his laughter more frequent. By the third hour past midnight, Robert's stories began to slur together. His massive head nodded forward, his chin hitting his chest. He jerked awake, muttered a curse about Tywin Lannister, and took one final, massive gulp of stout. Then, his eyes rolled back. Robert slumped forward, his face landing squarely on his crossed arms on the heavy oak table. Within seconds, a loud, rattling snore began to echo in the pavilion. The king had been defeated by the cup. Ned sat in silence for a moment, listening to the deep breathing of the most powerful man in the world. He felt a pang of sympathy for his old friend. Robert had conquered a continent, but he was entirely trapped by his own victory. Ned stood up. He walked around the table and picked up a heavy fur mantle that had been discarded on a nearby chair. He draped it carefully over Robert's broad shoulders, making sure the king would not wake up shivering in the night air. Sleep well, Robert, Ned whispered. He picked up his sword belt from the chair, buckling it around his waist. He walked to the entrance of the pavilion and pushed the heavy canvas flap aside. The night air of Fair Isle hit him instantly. It was cool, carrying the sharp, clean scent of the ocean and the faint smell of burning wood from the dying campfires. The camp was silent now, the thousands of soldiers resting for the bloodshed to come. Ned took a deep breath, filling his lungs. He didn't feel the crushing weight of politics or the suffocating atmosphere of the court. He felt the cold, hard reality of the world, and he welcomed it. He walked through the quiet camp, his boots making no sound on the soft grass, heading toward his own modest tent. He had a war to finish, a fleet to command, and a growing pack waiting for him in the snow. The South could have their games. The wolf was going to finish this hunt and go home. 34 comments 0 vote. The gathering of fleets. It took nearly a week for the rest of the realm's forces to finally anchor at Fair Isle. By the sixth dawn, the horizon was swallowed by a forest of masts. The heavy war galleys of the Arbor ferried the massive hosts of the South across the straits. Banners bearing the Golden Lion, the Soaring Falcon, and the Golden Rose snapped proudly in the sea breeze, projecting a delayed but overwhelming display of royal might. Ned Stark had no interest in standing on the beaches to welcome latecomers. The fighting was done, and the inevitable jostling for prestige held no appeal for him. Instead, he spent his morning at the docks alongside Jorah, Benjen, and his ship captains. They inspected the minor splintering the northern Carracks had sustained from ramming and organized the provisioning required for the eventual voyage back to the Sunset Sea. By the time Ned trudged back up to the sprawling canvas city, the sun was hot and unforgiving. Approaching his stark, gray command tent, he noticed an anomaly. A guard clad in a crimson cloak and gold-chased breastplate stood rigidly by the entrance flap. Ned knew immediately who was inside. He paused before the sentry. "Sir Jaime is within." The Lannister man gave a crisp nod. "He is, Lord Stark." Ned acknowledged him and pushed past the heavy canvas, stepping into the shaded interior of his pavilion. Sprawled comfortably in Ned's own heavy wooden chair, with his booted feet resting carelessly on the edge of the map table, was the heir to Castle Rock. Jaime Lannister had shed his heavy plate in favor of a rich crimson tunic. In one hand, he swirled a silver cup, in the other, he loosely gripped Ned's personal, half-empty bottle of northern whiskey. "Put that down. It belongs to me," Ned stated evenly, crossing his arms over his chest. Jaime dropped his feet to the rug and offered a lazy, unapologetic smirk. "You failed to attend my wedding, Stark. Consider this your toll." "I sent a rather generous gift in my stead," Ned pointed out, moving to take the seat opposite the young lion. "That you did," Jaime admitted, taking a slow, appreciative sip of the amber spirit. "A shield of rippled steel. My father's armorers spent days arguing over how you managed to fold the metal without breaking it. It drew quite a few envious glares from others. Yet my new bride," Jaime chuckled, Linus was far more taken with the snow bear pelt. She had no idea bears grew so large, or so white. "She refuses to sleep without it." "I am pleased the Lady Linus finds it comfortable," Ned replied. He reached across the table and plucked a whiskey bottle from Jaime's loose grip. "That still does not grant you leave to plunder my private stores." Jaime offered a careless shrug. "I just endured a week at sea with my father, completely sober. I required something potent the moment I touched solid ground. And who better to supply the drink than the brewer himself?" Ned allowed a faint smile, imagining the relentlessly grim Tywin Lannister trapped on a rocking ship beside his arrogant son. "It is good to see you, Sir Jaime," Ned said truly. Jaime raised his cup in a mock toast. "And you, Stark, how fares the frozen wasteland? Have you grown accustomed to the cold, or just numb to it?" Ned set the bottle down, fixing Jaime with a flat stare. "You have grown a much sharper tongue since you discarded the white cloak." Jaime leaned forward, flashing his famously arrogant grin. "I am a Lannister. Hear me roar." Ned stared. Jaime stared back. Then, almost in unison, they both broke into genuine laughter. It was an unlikely kinship, forged in the ashes of the Mad King's throne room, built on a shared disdain for the hypocrisies of the Southern court. Ned retrieved a spare cup and poured himself a small measure of the spirit. The peaty, smoky burn grounded him. "Speak plainly," Ned said, setting the cup aside. "Why are you sitting in my tent? You ought to be with Lord Tywin, feigning interest in the siege plans for Pike." "Am I forbidden from visiting a friend?" Jaime feigned offense, but seeing Ned's raised eyebrow, he sighed. "Very well, I am here to discuss betrothals. By my father's strict command." Jaime took another sip. "There, I have officially raised the topic of marriage pacts as ordered. We can consider that unpleasantness concluded." Ned frowned, genuinely confused. "Marriage pacts? You have been wed for less than a year. Who exactly are you offering to betroth?" "Linus is with child as we speak," Jaime explained, a brief, surprising flash of pride crossing his face before he masked it. "She rests safely behind the walls of Castle Rock. The news of Lannisport burning frightened her terribly, but she is well guarded." I will likely miss the birth because of this Greyjoy nuisance, but I imagine she will forgive me. You are content in your match, then? Ned asked. Jaime pulled a face, swirling his drink. My father is content. She is fair to look upon, and the Hightowers have taught her how to manage a keep as vast as the rock. Her bloodline is flawless, yet, she reminds me a fraction too much of my sister. In what way? She is spoiled, Jaime said bluntly. In vain. Both women possess impossibly expensive tastes. It is a blessing I am a wealthy man. A lesser lord would beggar himself keeping her adorned. A marriage of duty, Ned observed quietly, tapping the table. Even so, you cannot betroth an unborn child. You do not even know if you will have a son or a daughter. My father rarely concerns himself with such minor details, Jaime waved the objection away. If you wish to suffer a headache, you may discuss it with him. Your new fleets and sudden wealth have made him attentive. He wishes to intertwine House Lannister and House Stark so both may reap the rewards without stepping on each other's cloaks. Before Ned could respond to Tywin's heavy-handed maneuvering, the tent flap parted. Two of Ned's squires entered, carrying a heavy wooden tray laden with hot food. Ned noticed the single trencher placed before him. Bring another portion, he commanded. And a fresh plate. The squires bowed and hurried away. Ned pushed the hot clay dish across the table toward his guest. Taste this, Ned offered. It is a new recipe we have adopted in the north. You may find it to your liking. Jaime eyed the food with mild suspicion. It was not a standard roasted joint or a watery stew. The deep dish was filled with rich, savory minced mutton cooked down in a thick, dark gravy with carrots and onions. Covering the entire top was a thick, baked crust of mashed earth apples, browned and crisp at the peaks. Jaime picked up a spoon, scooped a generous bite, blew on it to cool the steam, and tasted it. His eyebrows shot upward. The hearty, savory meat paired flawlessly with the buttery, dense root mash. Gods, that is exceptional, Jaime admitted, taking a second, larger bite. It is heavy, perfect for surviving a winter draft. What do you call it? Barrowman's pie, Ned answered, pouring himself some water. It puts the earth apples grown by our mountain clans to excellent use. I can have my cooks write out the recipe for your men before you return to the Westerlands. See that you do, Jaime said, pointing his spoon at Ned. He swallowed, and his demeanor shifted, the easy banter vanishing. I only mentioned my father's demands because he wishes to sink his claws into the north. It does not mean I support his schemes. However, there is another betrothal I genuinely came here to discuss. Ned's eyes narrowed slightly. Which one? Princess Rhaenys, Jaime said, lowering his voice. And her betrothal to your heir, Cregan. Ned leaned back, lacing his fingers together. That was the understanding we reached in the capital. There was talk of her marrying Robert's heir, or mine. We agreed she would remain safely in the north. That was the agreement then, Jaime countered. Times change. Jon Arryn is currently pressuring the king to formalize a betrothal between Rhaenys and Prince Joffrey. A cold spike of irritation hit Ned. There is a vast difference in their ages. Rhaenys is nearly 10. Joffrey is a toddler. I do not dispute that, Jaime said, setting his spoon down. But there is a far darker reason. Ned remained silent, allowing the Kingslayer to continue. Jaime stared at his hands. For a fleeting moment, the arrogant air of Castle Rock faded, revealing a man deeply troubled by his own kin. The prince is my nephew, Jaime said softly. He shares my blood. He is also a vicious little monster. Ned blinked, taken aback by the absolute lack of familial affection. Not in the way I was, Jaime clarified swiftly. All young boys can be terrors, breaking things, ignoring their tutors, causing grief. That is merely youth. Joff is cruel. He delights in pain. I place the blame squarely on my sister. Jaime picked up his cup again, staring into the dark amber liquid. She coddles him beyond reason. She whispers in his ear that he is a god walking among mortals. And our king ignores the boy completely. He pays him no mind. Perhaps the boy might outgrow it, but right now, there is a darkness taking root in him. I even approached my father, suggesting Joffrey be fostered at the rock so Tywin could take him in hand. My father is a ruthless man, but he understands discipline and order better than anyone. And the Queen's reaction, Ned prompted. My sweet sister vehemently refused, Jaime said, his tone turning bitter. She is furious with me. She refuses to hear a single word of criticism against her golden child, least of all from me. Why? Ned asked, intrigued by the fracture in the Lannister twins' famously close bond. Why the enmity? Because I agreed to cast aside the white cloak and take my place as our father's heir, Jaime replied, shrugging, though the motion was stiff. Years ago, father promised Cersei she would be queen. She truly believed she would wed Rhaegar. She spun a grand, romantic fantasy where I would join the Kingsguard, and we would remain together in the Red Keep, inseparable as we had always been. Well, she got her crown, albeit with a different king. But when I refused to play my assigned role in her mummer's farce, when I chose to go west, she felt abandoned. Ned nodded slowly. He understood the twisted, toxic nature of their relationship far better than Jaime likely realized. So, Jaime concluded, meeting Ned's gaze directly. You agree the age gap makes the match absurd, but you must also consider that my nephew is deeply troubled. Ned maintained a face carved of northern granite, though his internal thoughts were far harsher. It is a pity one cannot strike a prince, Ned thought grimly. A firm hand now might save the realm from a tyrant later. But Ned knew the truth of Joffrey's nature. It wasn't just poor parenting, it was a madness, magnified by Cersei's blinding vanity. He would never allow Rhaenys to be dragged into the viper's nest of King's Landing while Joffrey drew breath. I hear your warning, Jaime, Ned said evenly. And I am grateful for it. I was hoping, Jaime added quietly, that you would ensure Rhaenys is formally betrothed to Cregan. Quickly, before Lord Arryn can convince Robert that tying the dragon to the stag is best for the realm. Jaime was attempting to shield the girl he had failed to protect from the terror of the sack. It was a quiet, desperate attempt at redemption. Ned studied the Lannister lord. They are still children, Ned stated firmly. I will not force a marriage upon either of them before their time. However, Ned offered a slow, reassuring nod. If, in the future, they find favor with one another, I will not stand in their way. In truth, I would welcome the union and I will make sure they are married to each other if they want to. Rhaenys belongs to the north now. Jaime exhaled a long, slow breath, the rigid tension finally leaving his shoulders. He picked up his spoon and eagerly returned to his meal. Excellent, Jaime said around a mouthful of pie. Now, write down that recipe. My pregnant wife demands hearty meals, and if the cooks serve me one more roasted swan, I may throw myself from the highest tower of the rock. 35 comments 0 vote. The War Council. The command pavilion of King Robert Baratheon was a vast expanse of yellow and black canvas, heated by massive iron braziers. It held the combined martial and political power of the Seven Kingdoms. Around the heavy oak map table stood the Lords Paramount of Westeros. Tywin Lannister stood rigid in his crimson and gold, his face carved from cold stone. Mace Tyrell, the Lord of Highgarden, took up considerable space, his doublet straining against his girth. Jon Arryn, Hand of the King, looked weary but focused, his eyes scanning the detailed parchment map of the Iron Islands spread before them. And leaning heavily over the table, a goblet of wine in his hand, was the king. Pike is a fortress of jagged stone and miserable weather, Robert announced, pointing a thick finger at the map. Balon sits in his towers, expecting us to break our teeth on his walls. Jon Arryn stepped forward, smoothing the edges of the map. Which is precisely why we must not attack Pike immediately, Your Grace. If we lay siege to the Greyjoy seat while the other islands remain unsubdued, we expose our rear to constant harassment. The Ironborn are raiders. They will cut our supply lines and burn our transport ships while we are pinned against Pike's walls. Jon Arryn looked around the table, ensuring he had the attention of the High Lords. We must sever the tentacles before we strike the head, Jon proposed. We divide our forces. We strike Harlaw, Great Wick, Old Wick, and Orkmont simultaneously. We crush their bannermen, destroy their shipyards, and leave Balon entirely isolated. Only then do we converge on Pike for the final blow. Robert grunted, taking a long pull of wine. He slammed the goblet down. It delays the main event. But it makes tactical sense. I want this rebellion completely crushed. Ned Stark stepped forward from his place near the shadows of the tent. He wore his heavy gray mail, ice strapped securely across his back. The northern host will take Harlaw and Old Wick, Ned stated clearly, his voice carrying absolute authority. Mace Tyrell scoffed, a wet, dismissive sound. Harlaw is the richest and most heavily populated of the islands, Lord Stark. 10 Towers is a formidable keep. And Old Wick is their holy ground. Perhaps you should leave the heavy lifting to the Reach. We brought 60,000 men. You brought 60,000 men in transport galleys, Ned corrected, turning his cold gray eyes on the Lord of Highgarden. My men are already embarked on warships designed for the Sunset Sea. I have the speed and the siege equipment. We will handle the harlaws and the drums. Tywin Lannister spoke up, his voice a low, commanding rumble. The Westerlands will take Great Wick. It is the largest island. The Good Brothers have mines and strongholds there. We will ensure they produce no more iron for Balon's war. And the royal fleet, supported by the Redwyne galleys, will subdue Orkmont and Blacktide, Jon Arryn concluded, nodding at Lord Paxter Redwyne, who stood near Mace. We cast a net over the entire archipelago. Within a fortnight, the Greyjoys will hold nothing but the rocks beneath their boots. The lords around the table nodded in agreement. The strategy was sound, overwhelmingly brutal, and guaranteed victory. Then it is settled, Robert declared, a fierce, eager light burning in his blue eyes. We sail at first light. Prepare your men. The lords began to turn away from the table, the meeting seemingly concluded. A moment, Ned said. The lords paused, looking back at the Warden of the North. There is the matter of the aftermath, Ned said, keeping his focus on the hand of the king. What is our stand regarding the thralls once we conquer these islands? Mace Tyrell let out a loud, genuine laugh. He looked at Ned as if the Northern Lord had just asked a question about the weather in ET. The thralls, Mace asked, his tone dripping with condescension. They are mudgrubbers and rockbreakers, Lord Stark. Half-starved captives from lesser raids. Who cares about a flock of unwashed slaves? Let the Ironborn keep their miserable servants, or let them drown in the sea. It matters not to high lords. Ned did not raise his voice. Mudgrubbers feed Highgarden, Lord Tyrell, Ned retorted sharply. Or do you conjure your feasts out of the thin air? Mace Tyrell's face flushed a deep, angry red. He opened his mouth to shout an insult, but a sharp look from Robert silenced him. Ned turned back to the map, addressing the king in the hand. The Ironborn reave because they do not sow, Ned explained, quoting the Greyjoy words. They do not farm. They do not mine. The thralls do it for them. The thralls build their ships, forge their axes, and grow the meager crops that sustain their islands. They are a free labor force. Ned placed his hands flat on the table, leaning in. If we defeat their lords, burn their fleets, and then sail away leaving the thralls behind, we achieve nothing but a temporary peace. In 10 or 20 years, Balon Greyjoy, or his successor, will simply use that same slave labor to build another fleet. We must remove the foundation of their culture. We must take the thralls. Tywin Lannister evaluated the proposal. Removing the thralls would cripple the Iron Islands economically for a century. It is a harsh measure, but effective. However, it presents a logistical nightmare. There are tens of thousands of thralls across these islands. Transporting them is a massive undertaking. And once transported, what do we do with them? King's Landing is already overcrowded. The Westerlands have no need for undisciplined labor. I will take them, Ned said immediately. The tent fell utterly silent. Jon Arryn stared at him. You, Ned, you would take tens of thousands of thralls to the north. The north is vast, Jon, Ned said. And it is empty. We have need of more labor in the new gift. Mace Tyrell sneered. You wish to become a slaver, Lord Stark. I wish to become an emancipator, Ned corrected, his gray eyes flashing. Thrall talking is an abomination. I will take these people north. I will free them the moment they step off the ships. I will offer them land in the gift. They will be fed, clothed, and paid for their labor as free men and women. Mace Tyrell exchanged a look of pure bewilderment with Paxter Redwyne. An honorable fool with a weak heart, the Lord of Highgarden thought, stifling a laugh. Feeding, clothing, and paying tens of thousands of destitute, broken refugees. He will empty his own treasury in a year out of misplaced northern pity. Let the wolf bleed his own coffers dry. Tywin Lannister, however, did not smile. His green eyes narrowed as he evaluated the Lord of Winterfell. He remembered the reports from the west, the clear glass, the potent spirits, the vast stretches of smooth stone roads. He does not want them for pity, Tywin realized, the strategic calculation clicking into place. He wants them for labor. He is expanding his industries, and he needs cheap, desperate hands to work his furnaces, his fields, and his mines. He is using our war to secure a massive workforce to produce his goods. Yet, even recognizing the ploy, Tywin saw the immediate tactical benefit to the crown. Removing the thralls crippled the Ironborn permanently, and transporting them was a logistical nightmare Tywin had no desire to fund or manage. If Stark wanted to absorb that staggering upfront cost to fuel his northern factories, let him. Robert Baratheon waved a dismissive hand, entirely uninterested in the economics of peasants. If you want to drag a horde of miserable thralls back to the snow, Ned, be my guest. It saves us the trouble of dealing with them. Does anyone object to Lord Stark taking the spoils of labor? Tywin Lannister gave a single, curt nod. The West has no objections. The Reach gladly yields its share of the thralls to Winterfell, Mace Tyrell added quickly, eager to wash his hands of the matter and let the Stark fool bankrupt himself. Then it is a royal decree, Jon Arryn finalized, making a note on his parchment. Any thrall found on the conquered islands is to be turned over to the Northern Fleet for transport and emancipation. Ned said respectfully, "Thank you, my lords." Internally, Ned was smiling. It was a massive coup. He had just secured a massive influx of able-bodied workers for his rapidly expanding industrial empire. The glassworks, the concrete production, the road building, all of it required manpower. The thralls of the Iron Islands were hard-working survivors. Given freedom, warm clothes, and regular meals, they would become the engine of the New North. The council adjourned. The lords filed out into the cool night air of Fair Isle, preparing for the bloodshed of the morrow. The next morning, the harbor of Fair Isle was a scene of controlled, massive mobilization. Thousands of men marched up the gangplanks. Horses were loaded into the holds of the transport galleys. The air rang with the shouts of captains, the creaking of timber, and the snap of heavy canvas catching the wind. Ned stood on the main pier, observing the boarding of the Western Fleet. The 50 heavy northern carracks dominated the docks, their dark wooden high castles making the southern galleys look fragile by comparison. Benjen Stark walked up the pier. He wore a suit of boiled leather reinforced with steel studs, a practical armor designed to float in case he was thrown overboard. At 16 years of age, he looked serious, focused, and entirely ready for the responsibility resting on his shoulders. "The men are boarded, Ned," Benjen reported. "The holds are packed with siege equipment and rations. We are ready to sail." Ned turned to his younger brother. This was the moment. He had trained Benjen in the yard, taught him the rudimentary focus of the force in the Godswood, and tutored him in the management of the glassworks. Now, he had to trust him with an army. "You have command of half the ships," Ned said, 25 carracks. 5,000 men, Karstarks, Glovers, and a detachment of the Wolfguard. Benjen took the scroll, his grip firm. Old Wick. Old Wick, Ned confirmed. "It is the holiest island of the Ironborn. It is where they hold their kingsmoots. The drums rule there from Shatterstone. They are proud, hard men. They will not surrender easily. We will break them," Benjen said confidently. "Do not underestimate them, Ben," Ned warned, his voice low. "They fight with the desperation of fanatics on that island." Benjen nodded, absorbing the instruction. "I will not let pride blind me. I will take the island, secure the thralls, and meet you at Pike." "Good," Ned said. He reached out and gripped Benjen's shoulder tightly. "You are the Lord of Sea Dragon Point. Show the Ironborn the teeth of the New North." Benjen offered a fierce, wolfish grin. "They will learn to fear the sea." The younger Stark turned and walked briskly down the pier, boarding his flagship, a formidable carrack named the Icebreaker. Ned watched him go. He felt the steady, grounded energy of his brother in the Force. Benjen was ready. Ned turned toward his own flagship, the Winter's Wrath. His target was Harlaw. The island was governed from the massive fortress of 10 towers by Lord Roderick Harlaw, known as the Reader. Roderick was not a typical Ironborn reaver. He was an intellectual, a pragmatist, and perhaps the only man on the islands who truly understood how doomed Balon Greyjoy's rebellion was from the start. Ned had no intention of leveling 10 towers if he could avoid it. He wanted to preserve the wealth of Harlaw and capture its massive population of thralls intact. He intended to offer the Reader a harsh truth, backed by overwhelming military force. Ned walked up the gangplank. "All lines cast off, Lord Stark." The captain shouted. "We await your word." Ned looked out across the harbor. The royal fleet was already moving, hundreds of sails catching the morning wind, spreading out across the Sunset Sea to deliver the king's justice. "Raise the sails," Ned commanded, looking toward the dark horizon of the Iron Islands. "Set course for Harlaw." The massive lateen sails unfurled, catching the wind with a loud, explosive snap. The heavy northern leviathans pulled away from Fair Isle, cutting through the waves with terrifying speed, bringing the true winter to the shores of the Ironborn. 35 comments 0 vote. The Reader. The Sunset Sea was a cold, unforgiving mistress, but the Winter's Wrath rode her waves with absolute dominance. After a few days of sailing north from Fair Isle, the jagged coastline of Harlaw broke the horizon. The wind was stiff, filling the massive triangular sails of the northern carracks and driving them forward with a relentless, terrifying speed. Ned Stark stood at the high helm of the flagship, his grey cloak whipping around his armored shoulders. The salt spray crusted on his beard, but his grey eyes were fixed dead ahead. Rising from the rocky shores of the island was a massive, hulking structure of pale stone. 10 Towers. True to its name, it was a sprawling, mismatched fortress boasting 10 distinct structures, some square, some round, some octagonal. It was the seat of House Harlaw, the richest and most populous of the Iron Islands. It was an intimidating sight, built to withstand the harshest storms and the fiercest sieges. Beside Ned stood Lord Jorah Mormont, the commander of the Western Fleet Vanguard. The Lord of Bear Island wore his floating boiled leather armor, his hand resting eagerly on the pommel of his broadsword. "We are entering the range of their scorpions, Lord Stark," Jorah reported, his voice tight. The seasoned warrior was sweating despite the sea chill, his knuckles white as he gripped his hilt. He eyed the murder holes and high parapets of the fortress, expecting a volley of iron bolts at any moment. The silence of the island felt like a tightened noose. It felt like a trap. Ned did not draw his sword. He did not order the battle horns blown. Instead, he stood completely exposed on the high deck, breathed evenly, and closed his eyes. He became an eerie statue of absolute stillness amidst a war fleet. Jorah watched his liege lord, a flicker of genuine alarm crossing his mind. Has he gone mad with arrogance? Ned extended his consciousness outward, letting his senses reach across the churning water. He felt the heavy stone of 10 Towers. He expected to feel the chaotic, boiling heat of an ironborn host preparing for a desperate defense, the sharp spikes of fear, bloodlust, and panic that always preceded a siege. Instead, he felt a strange, ordered calm. The castle was occupied, certainly, but the garrison was not manning the walls with frantic energy. There was no surge of archers to the parapets, no hasty loading of catapults. It felt quiet, too quiet. Ned opened his eyes. "We hold our position, Lord Jorah," Ned commanded smoothly. "Keep the men at their stations, but lower the bows. They are surrendering." Jorah frowned, his warrior's instinct balking at the restraint. "Surrendering, my lord, no word has been spoken. No white flag flies. If we sail into the harbor unchallenged, they could attempt to drop defensive chains and trap us in the shallows." "They lack the chains to trap 50 carracks," Ned replied evenly. "And I sense no trap. If they loose a single arrow, or load a single siege engine, you have my full permission to attack and turn their towers to rubble. But until then, we hold." Jorah gave a stiff nod, still looking unconvinced. "Hold your fire," he roared down to the main deck. "Keep your eyes sharp, but no man looses a bolt without the Lord's word." The northern fleet sailed onward, an armada of dark wood and iron bearing down on the coast. They passed the outer shoals and entered the deepwater harbor beneath the shadow of 10 Towers. The silence was eerie. In any other ironborn port, longships would have swarmed out to meet them, seeking to board and brawl upon the decks. But the harbor of Harlaw was remarkably empty of warships. The few merchant cogs and fishing skiffs anchored there bobbed harmlessly in the tide. As the winter's wrath drew closer to the shingle beach, the reason for the silence became apparent. There were no ranks of spearmen waiting on the docks. There were no reavers screaming curses at the Greenlanders. Standing alone on the rocky shore, flanked by only a half-dozen unarmed guards, was a single man. The pragmatist of Pike. "Drop anchor," Ned commanded. "Prepare the longboats. Lord Jorah, you and a detachment of the Wolfguard are with me. The rest of the fleet maintains high alert." The heavy iron anchors plunged into the sea. Within minutes, the longboats were lowered, hitting the water with a rhythmic splash. Ned stepped into the lead boat, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his longsword. Jorah sat beside him, his eyes scanning the windows of 10 Towers for hidden archers. The oarsman pulled hard, driving the small craft through the surf until the keel ground against the pebbled beach. Ned stepped out, his heavy boots crunching on the stones. He walked forward to meet the man waiting for them. Roderick Harlaw did not look like a typical ironborn lord. He wore no heavy plate, no kraken-shaped helm, and he carried no battle-axe. He was a slender man, dressed in fine but unostentatious dark wool. His brown hair was thinning, and he looked remarkably tired. Tucked under his left arm was a thick, leather-bound book. As Ned approached, Roderick closed the book and offered a deep, formal bow. "Lord Stark," Roderick said, his voice cultured and clear. "Welcome to Harlaw." "Lord Harlaw," Ned replied, stopping a few paces away. His Wolfguard fanned out behind him, their hands near their hilts, their eyes sweeping the perimeter. I expected a harsher greeting. Your king declared war upon the realm. Roderick offered a weary, bitter smile. My king declared war upon reality, Lord Stark. I am a reader of books, not a dreamer of ancient, sunken glories. Roderick tapped the thick, leather-bound book tucked under his arm. Nymeria of the Rhoynar faced the Valyrian freehold and their dragons, he noted dryly. She realized that stone walls do not stop dragonfire, so she put her people on ships and fled. I look out at your floating fortresses, Lord Stark, and I realize my stone walls will not stop your iron bolts. I am choosing Nymeria's pragmatism over Balon's pride. Ned smiled faintly, recognizing a fellow pragmatist in a world obsessed with foolish honor. You are surrendering the island, Ned stated. I am, Roderick agreed without hesitation. The gates of 10 Towers are open. My garrison is disarmed. The island of Harlaw yields to the Iron Throne, and to the Warden of the North. Jorah Mormont let out a low grunt of surprise. A bloodless victory in the Iron Islands was virtually unheard of. It is a wise choice, Lord Harlaw, Ned said, his tone softening a fraction. You have saved your people from a terrible slaughter. I have saved what I can, Roderick said. He looked at the northern soldiers. I assume you have come to enact the king's justice. To strip the island of its wealth. I have come to strip the island of its foundation, Ned corrected him. King Robert and Hand of the King John Arryn have decreed that the thrall system of the Iron Islands is to be dismantled. Every thrall on Harlaw is to be turned over to my fleet. They will be taken north as free men and women to work for wages. Roderick's eyes widened slightly, the financial ruin of the decree hitting him immediately. Without the thralls to mine the ore and farm the sparse crops, Harlaw's wealth would be severely crippled for a generation. Yet, he simply sighed and nodded. A heavy price, Roderick murmured. But lighter than ash. I will have my captains gather the thralls at the docks. They are yours, Lord Stark. We will discuss the finer terms of the surrender, the tribute, and the oaths of fealty, Ned said. But we will not discuss them here. The war is not yet finished. Pike still stands. Ned gestured toward the longboats. Until this rebellion is fully concluded, Lord Harlaw, you will be my guest aboard the Winter's Wrath. You will be treated with the honor due your station, but you will remain under guard as a prisoner of war. Roderick looked at the massive flagship, then back at his own castle. He did not argue. It was the standard practice of war, and far better than being put to the sword. I accept your terms, Roderick said. He turned to a stout, older man standing behind him in the small delegation, a cousin bearing the silver scythe of their house on his tunic. Sigfrid, Roderick addressed the man. You have the castle in my absence. See that Lord Stark's men are given no trouble. Turn over the thralls peacefully. Any man who draws steel against the Northmen is to be executed as a traitor to House Harlaw. Am I understood? It will be done, my lord. Sigfrid bowed deeply, his face grave. Roderick turned back to Ned, adjusting the book under his arm. I am ready, Lord Stark. Though I hope your ship has a quiet corner. I was just in the middle of a rather fascinating history of the Rhoynar. Ned allowed a rare, genuine smile to touch his lips. He respected a man who valued knowledge over senseless pride. I believe we can find a quiet cabin for you, Lord Harlaw, Ned said. Come. Within hours, the transfer was executed with strict discipline. Detachments of northern marines moved into the port towns of Harlaw, overseeing the peaceful collection of the thralls. There were thousands of them, men and women stolen from the coasts of Westeros and Essos over the years. When the northern heralds announced they were to be taken to Winterfell not as slaves, but as paid laborers with the promise of freedom and warm shelter, the initial terror turned to a tentative, desperate hope. They were loaded onto the deepest holds of the transport ships that trailed the Carrick vanguard. Ned did not linger on the island. He left a sufficient garrison to hold 10 towers and returned to the Winter's Wrath with his new highborn prisoner. Roderick Harlaw was given the use of a spacious officer's cabin near the stern. As the fleet prepared to weigh anchor, Roderick stood on the quarterdeck with Ned, watching the sailors expertly manage the triangular lateen sails. The reader looked up at the towering masts, his eyes calculating the angles and the wind shear. This design, Roderick said, his voice filled with genuine intellectual awe. It defies the traditional naval architecture of the Summer Isles. The way your men tack against the wind, it is extraordinary, Lord Stark. Did you purchase these designs from a Bravo Sea guild? I designed them myself, Lord Harlaw, Ned replied, keeping his gaze fixed on the western horizon. Roderick stared at him, the book in his hand forgotten. You, a lord of the north. We have long winters to sit by the fire and think, Ned said simply, offering no further explanation of the vast, otherworldly repository of knowledge held within his mind. I see, Roderick murmured, looking at Ned with a new respect. Balin was a fool to wake the wolf. He thought he was striking at a frozen wasteland. He did not realize he was attacking the sharpest mind in Westeros. Balin Greyjoy's realization is coming, Ned said, his voice turning cold. He turned to the helmsman. All ships, weigh anchor. Ned commanded, his voice carrying down the deck. Set the course west by southwest. The great horn of the winter's wrath blew, a deep, resonant sound that echoed across the water, signaling the fleet to move. The massive carracks turned as one, their iron-capped prows cutting through the swells. Where do we sail, Lord Stark? Jorah Mormont asked, stepping up beside him. Ned looked out toward the dark, churning waters of the Sunset Sea. He could almost feel the jagged rocks of the Greyjoy seat waiting in the distance. We meet the king, Ned said grimly. We sail for Pike. 28 comments 0 vote. Old Wyke. The winter's wrath cut through the dark, churning waters of the Sunset Sea with the relentless grace of a predator that knew it had already won the hunt. Behind the massive flagship, the remaining half of the Western fleet sailed in perfect formation. Their holds were deep, their high castles bristling with heavy iron scorpions, and their triangular lateen sails caught the stiff autumn breeze with explosive efficiency. They had left the subdued island of Harlaw behind, leaving a garrison to secure the keep of 10 towers and manage the newly emancipated thralls. Lord Jorah Mormont stood on the quarterdeck beside Eddard Stark, the salt spray misting against his boiled leather armor. The Lord of Bear Island looked energized. Victory had been claimed, and now the ultimate prize awaited them. The wind is strongly in our favor, Lord Stark, Jorah reported, pointing toward the southern horizon. With the lateen rig, we can make excellent time. If we press the sails and maintain this heading, we will reach Pike by tomorrow evening. We can join King Robert's siege before the vanguard even sets up their trebuchets. Ned Stark stood perfectly still, his gray cloak wrapped tightly around his shoulders. He looked out over the rolling gray waves, his eyes devoid of the eager bloodlust that animated his bannermen. Signal the fleet, Lord Jorah, Ned commanded, his voice calm and unhurried over the roar of the sea. Reef the mainsails, half-mast. We reduce our speed. Jorah blinked, his thick brow furrowing in confusion. Reduce our speed, my lord, the king has called for a gathering at Pike. If we arrive late. We will not be late, Ned corrected smoothly. We will be precisely on time. The time of my choosing. Ned turned to look at the seasoned warrior. He respected Jorah's tactical mind, but the man still thought like a traditional Westerosi lord, hungry for immediate glory, eager to be the first over the breach. Ned was operating on an entirely different level of strategy. Tywin Lannister joined late in Robert's rebellion, Ned said, his voice dropping to a glacial chill. He let us bleed the dragons, and then he claimed the glory of the sack. Now, it is the lion's turn to bleed. Jorah paused, a slow, grim smile breaking through his beard as he recognized the ruthless poetry of the command. King Robert has 60,000 men at his disposal, Ned continued. Pike is an ancient, formidable fortress. The initial assault on those stone walls will be a slaughter. Let Lord Tywin break his golden army against the Kraken's shell to prove his loyalty. I will not throw away northern lives to batter down a gate that the south has more than enough men to break. We will arrive when the heavy lifting is done. Jorah stared at his liege lord. The sheer pragmatism of the strategy was startling, bordering on cold-blooded. Yet, as a lord who cared deeply for his own Bear Islanders, Jorah could not deny the wisdom of preserving their strength. The Northmen would arrive as fresh, undisputed victors to a siege camp exhausted by the brutal work of scaling walls. You fight a different kind of war, Lord Stark, Jorah said with respect. I fight the war that ensures we have men left to bring the harvest in when we return home, Ned said softly. Trim the sails, Jorah. Let us enjoy the sea air. We take our time. Jorah bowed deeply. At once, my lord. As the orders were shouted down the decks and the massive sails were partially drawn in, slowing the great leviathans to a leisurely crawl, Ned looked back toward the north. He had faith in his strategy, and he had faith in his blood. Give them hell, Benjen, Ned thought, extending a faint ripple of confidence into the ether. The holy shores. Miles to the northwest, the sea was not calm. It was a boiling cauldron of foam and fury, breaking violently against the most sacred ground in the Iron Islands. Old Wick. It was a desolate, wind-scarred rock, lacking the wealth of Harlaw or the sheer size of Great Wick. But it possessed something far more dangerous, fanaticism. This was the island where the Grey King had supposedly slain the sea dragon Naga. This was where the Kingsmoots were held among the colossal, petrified ribs of the ancient beast. This was the spiritual heart of the Old Way. Benjen Stark stood at the prow of the icebreaker, the flagship of his 25 carracks. The salt wind whipped his dark hair, but his grey eyes were locked onto the shoreline. The Ironborn of Old Wick had not surrendered peacefully like Roderick Harlaw. They had chosen to fight. Dozens of longships had attempted to launch from the shingle beaches to intercept the northern fleet, but they had been met with a devastating barrage of heavy scorpion fire. The water near the shore was littered with the splintered husks of clinker-built hulls and the floating bodies of drowned reavers. But the true threat was on the land. Thousands of Ironborn warriors were massed on the stony beaches, blocking the path up to the hills. They were whipped into a frothing frenzy by the drowned priests, who waded into the freezing surf, screaming prayers and splashing saltwater over the armored men. At the center of the host, standing atop a rocky outcropping, stood a man clad in heavy iron plate, wielding a sword that caught the harsh sunlight and turned it the color of freshly spilled blood. Lord Dunstan Drum, the Bone Hand. They intend to hold the beach, Helman Tallheart shouted, bracing himself as the icebreaker dropped its massive iron anchors into the shallows. They have the high ground and the numbers, Lord Benjen. They have numbers, Benjen agreed, his voice surprisingly calm for a boy of 16 commanding his first true invasion. We have discipline. He remembered his training in the Godswood. He remembered Ned's hand on his shoulder, diagnosing his connection to the silent currents of the earth. You are a guardian, Ben. The wall runs deep in you. You endure. Benjen closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He took a slow, deep breath of the freezing sea air. He pushed his awareness down, past his racing heart, past his adrenaline, deep into the stones. He felt the heavy oak deck beneath his boots, the churning ocean, the bedrock of the island ahead. He didn't reach out like a storm. He dug in like a glacier. He felt the energy settle into his bones, heavy and immovable. The nervous tremor in his hands vanished. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, absolute certainty. Outwardly, he simply looked like a commander steeling his nerves. Benjen opened his eyes. They were as hard as flint. Deploy the landing craft, Benjen commanded, his voice carrying the deep, resonant timbre of the first men. Shield wall formation the moment the keels hit the stones. We do not charge, we march, we grind them into the dust. The heavy longboats were lowered from the carracks. Hundreds of northern marines, clad in boiled leather and carrying heavy oak shields, clambered down the ropes. Benjen took his place in the lead boat, standing at the prow. Beside him stood the fiercest of his vanguard, wielding their heavy spears, a dozen members of the Wolfguard, and Daisy Mormont, a wicked iron mace resting comfortably on her shoulder, a fierce grin splitting her face. The oarsmen pulled hard. The longboats surged through the surf, the waves crashing over the gunwales. On the shore, the Ironborn began to roar, a chaotic, blood-curdling cacophony of axes beating against iron shields. Arrows rained down from the cliffs, thudding into the wooden hulls of the longboats and splintering against the northern shields. Hold! Benjen shouted over the din, keeping his shield raised, his heightened awareness tracking the flight of the arrows, instinctively shifting to ensure none found a vital gap. With a violent crunch, the keel of Benjen's boat struck the shingle beach. Out! Benjen roared. He vaulted over the side, landing in knee-deep, freezing water. He didn't stumble. The energy of the earth rooted his stance. He moved forward, his sword drawn, his shield raised. The Northmen poured from the boats, ignoring the screaming Ironborn charging down the beach toward them. They didn't break ranks. They moved with the relentless, drilled precision that Ned had beaten into them. Shields locked, spears bristled outward. The two forces collided with a sound like a mountain shattering. The Ironborn fought like wild beasts. They threw themselves against the northern shield wall with reckless abandon, hacking wildly with their axes, screaming to the drowned god for strength. They expected the young northern commander to break. They expected him to panic under the sheer ferocity of the Old Way. They were gravely mistaken. Benjen Stark stood at the apex of the shield wall, directly in the path of the heaviest fighting. He did not look like a frightened boy, he stood like a castle wall. An Ironborn reaver, massive and heavily scarred, broke through a gap in the spear line and launched a two-handed overhand swing with a battle-axe, aiming directly to cleave Benjen's head in two. A normal man would have tried to dodge or frantically parry the crushing blow. Benjen simply raised his heavy oak shield. He channeled his inward focus to root his stance, locking his muscles and bones into a flawless, unyielding structure. The battle axe struck the center of Benjen's shield with a deafening crack. The Ironborn Reaver expected the sheer impact to shatter his arm or drive the Stark to his knees. Instead, the Reaver felt a shuddering jolt travel up the wooden haft of his axe, vibrating his own teeth. Benjen did not budge a single inch. He didn't even grunt. The shield held firm, immovable as solid iron. Before the stunned Ironborn could recover his balance, Benjen shoved his shield forward, smashing the heavy rim directly into the Reaver's face. As the man staggered, Daisy Mormont stepped in, swinging her mace in a brutal arc that caved in the side of his knee. The Reaver fell screaming into the mud, where Benjen's sword cleanly found his throat. "Hold the line," Benjen commanded, stepping over the dying man, his voice a steady, grounding beacon for the men around him. "Push them up the slope. Grind them down." The battle dissolved into bloody chaos around them, but Benjen and Daisy moved as a seamless unit. Daisy fought like a wildcat, her mace shattering shields and breaking bones, laughing fiercely into the sea spray. An Ironborn raider, seeing her heavily occupied with two spearmen, lunged at her exposed back with a rusted dirk. Benjen did not even turn his head. Trusting his heightened senses, he pivoted his wrist and drove his blade backward under his arm, perfectly impaling the attacker through the ribs. Daisy glanced back, saw the falling man, gave Benjen a bloody grin, and returned to her work. To the surrounding soldiers, Benjen Stark simply possessed the preternatural instincts of a seasoned veteran. The northern wall advanced. It was slow, methodical, and utterly ruthless. Every time an Ironborn charged, they broke against the immovable shields. Every time they faltered, the northern spears struck like vipers. Benjen fought mechanically, his mind completely clear. The silent currents fed him a constant sense of the battlefield. He felt the pressure of the men beside him, the shifts in the sand, the intent of the enemies before him. He was not a flashy duelist. He was simply a wall that killed anything that threw itself against it. They carved a bloody path up the shingle beach, pushing the Ironborn back toward the rocky hills. From the higher ground, a horn blew, a harsh, discordant wail. The Ironborn ranks suddenly parted, falling back with a mixture of reverence and fear. Down the rocky slope strode the Lord of Old Wick. Dunstan Drum was an older man, his face weathered into deep, harsh lines by decades of salt and cruelty. He wore a suit of heavy, blackened iron plate, but it was the weapon in his hand that commanded the battlefield. Red Rain. The Valyrian steel longsword was magnificent and terrifying. The dark ripples of the forged magic metal were tinted a deep, shimmering crimson, as if the blade was constantly slick with fresh blood. It was a sword stolen from the Westerlands centuries ago, a legendary weapon that had claimed 1,000 lives. Lord Drum pointed the crimson tip of the blade directly at Benjen Stark. "A wolf pup," Drum roared, his voice echoing over the clash of steel. "You dare bring your Greenland filth to the cradle of the drowned god? I will take your head, boy, and offer it to the sea." Benjen stepped out from the shield wall. "Benjen, hold," Daisy Mormont yelled, reaching out to grab his shoulder. "That is Valyrian steel." Benjen raised a hand, silencing the she-bear. He remembered Ned's warning vividly. "Do not cross blades with Red Rain. It will bite through an iron longsword like a twig. Pin him." He lowered his center of gravity, bringing his shield up tight against his chest, holding his standard northern longsword low. A normal commander would shout. A normal soldier would shake. Benjen did neither. He stood in the surf with the eerie, dead-eyed stillness of a frozen lake. The sheer, unnatural silence of his posture was more unnerving than any war cry. "Your god is dead, old man," Benjen said, his voice carrying a biting chill. "And your island belongs to Winterfell." With a scream of absolute fury, Dunstan Drum charged. Despite his age, Drum moved with the terrifying speed of a seasoned reaver. He swung Red Rain in a wide, sweeping arc, aiming to shear straight through Benjen's wooden shield and the arm behind it. Benjen did not attempt to parry the Valyrian steel with his own sword. That would be suicide. Using his perfect balance, Benjen pivoted on his heel, dropping his shoulder just enough. The crimson blade hissed through the air, shaving a thin layer of wood from the very edge of Benjen's shield, but failing to bite deep. Drum was surprised by the boy's agility, but he didn't relent. He reversed his grip, bringing the sword up in a brutal, gut-cleaving thrust. Benjen danced backward, his boots sliding flawlessly over the loose stones. The tip of Red Rain missed his belly by a fraction of an inch. To the onlookers, both Northern and Ironborn, it looked like the Stark boy was incredibly lucky, narrowly avoiding certain death by a hair's breadth. But internally, Benjen was perfectly calm. His unyielding focus allowed him to remain utterly unfazed by panic. He was reading Drum's balance and weight, calculating the heavy, overcommitted swings of a man used to his legendary weapon doing all the work. "Stand still and die, pup," Drum spat, panting slightly as he launched a flurry of rapid, alternating slashes. Benjen gave ground, letting Drum advance, letting the old man burn his stamina. He dodged, ducked, and offered the reinforced iron boss of his shield only when absolutely necessary, feeling the horrific cutting power of the Valyrian steel notch the iron with terrifying ease. Drum grew desperate, his pride wounded by his inability to strike down a teenager. He raised Red Rain high above his head with both hands, intent on delivering a final, overhead blow that would split Benjen from skull to groin. It was a massive, powerful strike, but it was entirely predictable. As the Crimson Blade began its descent, Benjen stopped retreating. He planted his back foot. He gathered his strength, pushing all of his hidden power into his legs and his shield arm. He did not try to block the blade, he attacked the man holding it. Benjen exploded upward and forward, closing the distance instantly. Before Red Rain could complete its downward arc, Benjen slammed his heavy oak shield directly into Drum's chest plate. He didn't just shove the man, he hit him with the impact of an iron ram. The blow was devastating. The heavy iron plate of Drum's armor visibly dented inward. The air was violently expelled from the Ironborn Lord's lungs in a sickening huff. The sheer, brutal power lifted Drum clean off his feet. The old man flew backward through the air, crashing heavily onto the jagged rocks of the shoreline. Red Rain slipped from his stunned, nerveless fingers, clattering onto the stones. Drum gasped, his chest heaving as he tried to draw breath into bruised lungs. He struggled to rise, reaching a desperate hand toward his fallen sword. Benjen did not give him the chance. He stepped forward, calm and methodical, and drove his northern longsword through the gap in Drum's armor at the neck, pinning the Lord of Old Wick to the stones. Dunstan Drum choked on his own blood, his eyes wide with shock, before the life finally faded from his weathered face. Silence swept over the immediate vicinity of the duel. The Ironborn warriors stared at the corpse of their lord. The Bone Hand, the wielder of the legendary red sword, had been physically battered and killed by a 16-year-old boy without a hint of trickery. To the men watching, the young Stark simply possessed overwhelming strength and perfect, ruthless timing. Benjen pulled his sword free and wiped it clean on Drum's cloak. He reached down and picked up Red Rain. Benjen wiped the dirt from the ruby pommel. "The sword of Castamer," Daisy murmured, stepping up beside him, panting heavily from the fighting. "Tywin Lannister has spent a fortune trying to buy a Valyrian blade, and you just picked up the one stolen from his own backyard." Benjen offered a faint, wolfish smirk. "Then he can't have this one back either." He held the crimson blade aloft, the sunlight catching the dark ripples. He turned his gaze upon the remaining Ironborn forces. His face was a mask of northern ice. "Your lord is dead," Benjen's voice roared across the beach, amplified by the natural echoes of the rocky cove. "Your sword is taken. Throw down your axes, or join him in the dirt." The drowned priests stopped their chanting. The Reavers looked at the dead body of Dunstan Drum, then at the towering, unbroken shield wall of the Northern Marines waiting behind the young Stark. The fanaticism broke, shattering against the harsh reality of their defeat. One by one, the axes and swords clattered onto the stones. The men of Old Wick fell to their knees in the surf. Benjen lowered Red Rain. He felt a profound sense of exhaustion creeping into his muscles as he released his inward hold on his power, the adrenaline fading to leave behind the soreness of battle. But he kept his posture rigid, refusing to show weakness before his men. "Secure the prisoners," Benjen ordered the Karstarks. "Round up the thralls for transport. Take control of Shatterstone and the Drum Towers. The island is ours." "Aye, Lord Benjen," Captain replied, looking at the young commander with a newfound respect. "It is done." Benjen looked at the crimson sword in his hand. He thought of Ned, who would be arriving at Pike long after the initial bloodshed. His brother had trusted him with an army and a kingdom's holiest ground. "I held the line, Ned," Benjen thought, a weary smile touching his lips. "And I got us a new sword." The North had taken the soul of the Iron Islands. All that remained was the crown. 29 comments 0 vote. The shadows of Pike. The Sunset Sea was a vast, unforgiving expanse of slate-gray water, churning under a sky that threatened a freezing rain. The wind was a constant, howling companion, tearing at the massive triangular lateen sails of the Winter's Wrath. Eddard Stark stood at the high helm of his flagship, wrapped in a heavy cloak of gray wool and direwolf fur. The salt spray froze on his beard, but his gaze remained fixed on the southern horizon. A deep, resonant blast from a mammoth horn echoed across the water. "Sails off the starboard bow," the lookout shouted from the crow's nest, pointing into the mist. Jorah Mormont stepped up beside Ned, his hand resting on the hilt of his broadsword. He squinted into the gloom. For a tense moment, there was only the rolling fog. Then, the mist parted, revealing a towering silhouette. It was a carrack, its dark wooden hull rising high above the waves. Atop its mainmast, snapping violently in the gale, was the white direwolf on a gray field, accompanied by a smaller pennant bearing a direwolf of blue and white. "The icebreaker," Ned said, a sense of relief washing the tension from his shoulders. "Benjen returns." Within the hour, the two halves of the Western fleet converged. The 50 Leviathans of the north formed a massive, impregnable wall of timber and iron upon the sea. The sheer scale of the armada was breathtaking, a floating city of war that defied the treacherous waters of the Iron Islands. A longboat was lowered from the icebreaker, cutting through the swells toward the winter's wrath. When it bumped against the hull, a figure clad in salt-stained boiled leather scrambled up the rope netting with the agility of a seasoned sailor. Benjen Stark swung his legs over the rail and dropped onto the deck. He looked older than he had when they parted at Fair Isle. The youthful eagerness in his eyes had been tempered by the harsh reality of command and the shedding of blood. "Ned," Benjen called out, striding across the deck. The two brothers embraced, a fierce, tight grip that spoke of shared blood and survived perils. "You took Old Wick?" Ned asked, pulling back to inspect his younger brother. "Shatterstone is ours," Benjen confirmed, his voice holding a new, deeper resonance. "The Holy Island is pacified. We stripped it of its thralls and salt wives, dismantled their shipyards, and broke their spirit. They will not trouble the mainland again." Benjen reached down to his hip. Hanging from his belt was a scabbard of black leather, but the hilt that protruded from it was unmistakable. It was crafted of dark metal, topped with a pommel set with a brilliant, blood-red ruby. "And I brought a souvenir," Benjen said, his lips curling into a faint, wolfish smile. Ned's eyes widened slightly as he recognized the weapon. He felt the dark, humming resonance of Valyrian steel through the hidden currents of his senses. "Red Rain," Ned murmured. "Lord Dunstan Drum, dead," Benjen stated simply, his face hardening. "He challenged me on the beach. He thought a boy of 16 would be easy prey for a legendary blade." "You did not cross swords with him?" Ned asked, a protective spike of alarm in his chest. "I remembered your warning," Benjen assured him. "I used the shield. I broke his ribs before he could swing that bloody thing twice." Benjen unbuckled the dark leather scabbard and held it out, offering the ancestral Valyrian steel to his liege lord. "It belongs to Winterfell now." Ned looked at the crimson blade, then pushed Benjen's hands gently back. "Keep it. Wield it until the end of this war. You earned it, Benjen." Benjen blinked in surprise, then offered a firm nod, strapping the legendary sword back to his hip. Ned let out a slow breath, clapping his brother on the shoulder. "You did well, Benjen. Better than well. You have proven yourself a true lord of the North." Benjen nodded, accepting the praise, then looked out over the bow of the ship. "And Harlaw?" "Surrendered without a drop of blood spilled," Ned replied. "Roderick Harlaw is a man who reads history. He had no desire to become a tragic footnote in it. The island is secure, and the thralls are currently sailing north in our transport galleys." "Then the tentacles are severed," Benjen noted, quoting the hand of the king's strategy. "All that remains is the head." "Pike," Ned said, turning his gaze forward. "The king is waiting." By midday, the jagged, unforgiving coastline of Pike finally broke through the perpetual gloom. It was not a castle in the traditional sense. It was a monument to defiance, built upon a headland that the sea had spent millennia trying to destroy. The relentless pounding of the waves had shattered the rock, leaving only 3 massive, isolated stacks of stone jutting out of the boiling ocean, connected to the mainland, and to each other, by terrifying, swaying rope bridges. The main fortress, the Great Keep, sat upon the largest of these islands, surrounded by secondary towers that clung to the sheer cliffs like barnacles. But before any army could even reach the bridges, they had to bypass the massive curtain wall that defended the landward approach. As the northern fleet drew closer, the sheer scale of the siege became apparent. The royal fleet, commanded by Lord Paxter Redwyn, formed a loose blockade around the seaward side of the fortress. Their war galleys looked frail and delicate compared to the towering northern carracks that now sailed past them, dropping heavy iron anchors into the deep water. But the true spectacle was on the land. Spread across the rocky, uneven ground before the landward walls of Pike was a military encampment of staggering proportions. 60,000 men from 5 different kingdoms had pitched their tents. The golden lion of the Westerlands, the soaring falcon of the Vale, the golden rose of the Reach, the leaping trout of the Riverlands, and the crowned stag of the Stormlands created a chaotic sea of color against the drab gray stone. Ned and Benjen took a longboat to the shore, accompanied by a heavy escort of the Wolfguard. As they walked through the camp, the reality of the siege hit them. It was a miserable, frustrating affair. The ground was a churned-up quagmire of mud and freezing rain. Soldiers huddled around smoky fires, their faces grim and drawn. The air was filled with the deafening, rhythmic thwack of heavy trebuchets launching massive stones at the curtain wall. But the walls of Pike were ancient, built of dark, oily stone that seemed to absorb the impacts. The boulders shattered against the battlements, leaving only shallow craters. Ned paused near the Westerlands encampment. The golden armor of Tywin Lannister's infantry was caked in mud and dried blood. They looked exhausted. Ned could see the lines of wounded men being tended by maesters outside the medical tents. "They've been throwing men at the main gate," Benjen observed, looking at the fresh corpses laid out under canvas tarps. "A frontal assault on a bottleneck. It's madness." "It's desperation," Ned corrected, his voice low. "The king lacks patience, and Tywin Lannister lacks the humility to admit a wall cannot be bought with gold or broken with a single charge." They continued their walk toward the center of the camp, where the massive, yellow and black royal pavilion stood, surrounded by the heavy infantry of the Stormlands. The war had stalled. The hammer had struck the anvil, but the iron was refusing to break. The interior of the royal pavilion was stiflingly hot, heated by massive iron braziers that struggled to combat the damp chill of the Iron Islands. It was also thick with tension. King Robert Baratheon paced the length of the heavy oak map table like a caged bear. He wore his battle armor, heavily dented from the deck fighting at Fair Isle, but his warhammer lay discarded on a nearby chair. He held a silver goblet of wine, the liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim as he moved. Gathered around the table were the most powerful men in Westeros. Tywin Lannister stood rigidly, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. His golden army had taken the brunt of the casualties in the initial, failed assaults on the gatehouse, and his pride was deeply bruised. Stannis Baratheon stood with his arms crossed over his chest. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the grinding of his teeth was audible in the quiet moments between Robert's shouts. Jon Arryn, the Hand of the King, looked older than his years, rubbing his temples as if trying to physically massage a solution into his brain. And sitting comfortably in a high-backed chair, eating a slice of roasted fowl, was Mace Tyrell, the Lord of Highgarden. He looked entirely unbothered by the slaughter occurring a mile away. 3 days, Robert roared, slamming his goblet onto the table, splashing red wine across the parchment map of Pike. 3 days we have sat in this freezing mud, throwing rocks at a wall that refuses to fall. I have 60,000 men. Balon Greyjoy has a few thousand starving reavers. Why is that gate still standing? The approach is too narrow, Your Grace, Tywin Lannister stated, his voice a flat, measured drawl that barely concealed his irritation. The land bridge restricts our numbers. We cannot bring our full force to bear. The moment my infantry reaches the gatehouse, they are subjected to crossfire from the flanking towers. It is a slaughterhouse. Then build larger siege engines. Robert shouted, bring down the towers. We lack the proper timber on this barren rock, Stannis Baratheon interjected, his tone rigid with martial logic. The trebuchets we have constructed are strained to their limits. The stone of Pike is unnatural. It resists the impact. Mace Tyrell wiped grease from his chin with a silk handkerchief and offered a patronizing smile. Perhaps, Your Grace, we are approaching this with too much haste. The Reach is accustomed to long sieges. We surround them, we cut off their supplies. We let them starve. In a few moons, Balon will be eating his own boots and begging to surrender. Robert turned his massive frame toward the Lord of Highgarden, his blue eyes flashing with absolute, terrifying rage. Starve them, Robert snarled, stepping closer to Mace, who instinctively shrank back in his chair. They are on an island, you fat fool. They have the entire sea behind them. Unless you have a way to boil the ocean, they can fish until the end of time. I am not sitting in this mud for a year while you eat roasted swan. Jon Arryn sighed, stepping forward to intervene before Robert decided to use his warhammer on his own bannerman. Your Grace, insults will not breach the walls. Lord Tywin is correct, the frontal assault is too costly. We must find another way. The heavy canvas flap of the pavilion was pushed aside. Eddard Stark stepped into the sweltering heat of the tent, followed closely by Benjen. Ned's gray cloak was heavy with sea salt, and his face was carved from the same uncompromising granite as his castle. Ned, Robert bellowed, the fury instantly vanishing from his face, replaced by a booming, genuine relief. Robert strode across the tent and pulled Ned into a crushing embrace. By the gods, it is good to see you, Robert laughed, slapping Ned's armored back. I was beginning to think you had sailed back to the snows to leave me with these old men and their excuses. The North does not abandon a fight, Robert, Ned said, returning the embrace firmly before stepping back. He nodded respectfully to the assembled lords. Lord Arryn, Lord Stannis, Lord Tywin. He barely glanced at Mace Tyrell. You took Harlaw? Jon Arryn asked, hope brightening his tired eyes. Harlaw is pacified, and the reader is my prisoner, Ned confirmed, moving to the map table. And my brother, Lord Benjen, has secured Old Wick and claimed the sword Red Rain from the corpse of Dunstan Drum. A murmur of genuine surprise rippled through the tent. Even Tywin Lannister raised a golden eyebrow at the mention of the legendary Valyrian steel blade being captured by a boy. Magnificent, Robert roared, slamming a hand on Benjen's shoulder, nearly buckling the teenager's knees. A true wolf. You'll be a terror when you get your full growth, lad. Robert turned back to Ned, his mood thoroughly improved, though the underlying frustration remained. You bring good news from the sea, Ned. But the land is a different story. Balin sits in his high tower, mocking us. The walls are too thick, and the gate is a killing ground. Ned looked down at the map of Pike. His mind analyzed the fortress. He saw the narrow land bridge. He saw the flanking towers. He saw the sheer, terrifying cliffs that dropped hundreds of feet into the churning ocean below the main keep. A frontal assault is exactly what Balin wants, Ned said, his voice calm, cutting through the residual heat of Robert's earlier temper. He wants to bleed your armies on the rocks. He wants to make the cost of victory so high that you lose the stomach for it. I have the stomach for 100 years of war, Robert growled. But I don't have the patience. Then we do not give him a frontal assault, Ned stated smoothly. We bypass the gate entirely. Tywin Lannister let out a short, dismissive breath. Bypass it, through the sky, Lord Stark. Or perhaps you intend to tunnel through solid bedrock. Neither, Ned said, looking the old lion directly in the eye. We go over the walls. From the sea. Mace Tyrell let out a loud, wet snort of derision. Climb the sea walls, Mace chuckled, shaking his head. Lord Stark, you must be jesting. Have you looked at those cliffs? They are sheer rock faces, battered by the ocean, slick with moss and ice. A man in full armor would fall to his death before he made it 10 feet. It is sheer suicide. Robert spun around, his eyes blazing, and threw a glare so terrifyingly lethal at Mace Tyrell that the Lord of Highgarden snapped his mouth shut with an audible click, his face draining of color. Shut up, Mace, Robert hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. He turned his attention back to Ned, his expression deadly serious. Go on, Ned, tell me how we climb the unclimbable. Ned placed his hands on the map, leaning forward. The sea-facing walls of the Great Keep are considered impregnable, Ned explained, tapping the seaward edge of the fortress diagram. Because they are sheer, Balin does not heavily garrison them. He relies on the ocean and the drop to protect his rear. His focus, and his men, are concentrated entirely on the main gatehouse to stop Lord Tywin's infantry. Ned looked around the table. I will send a band of climbers. A small, skilled force. They will scale the cliffs on the sea-facing side, bypass the battlements, and sneak into the courtyard of the main keep. Stannis Baratheon frowned, his strategic mind finding the flaw. Even if a few men could scale that cliff, which I highly doubt, they would be discovered the moment they crested the wall. 24 men cannot fight the entire garrison of Pike to reach the gatehouse. They won't have to fight them all, Ned said, because the garrison will be looking the other way. Ned looked directly at Robert. We need a diversion, Robert. A massive, overwhelming, deafening diversion. I need you to launch a full-scale assault on the main gatehouse. Not tomorrow, tonight. Tywin Lannister's jaw tightened. A night assault, in the mud and the rain. We will lose 1,000 men just in the confusion. You will lose fewer men than you have in the last 3 days, Ned countered coldly. You do not need to breach the gate, Lord Tywin. You just need to make them think you are trying. You need to pull every single Ironborn soldier to the front walls. You need to make so much noise that they cannot hear a few grappling hooks on the rear cliffs. And the moon, John Aaron asked, seeing the shape of the plan. The moon wanes tonight, Ned said. By the hour of the wolf, it will be low on the eastern horizon. The sea-facing cliffs will be shrouded in absolute darkness. They won't see my men climbing. And with Robert smashing the front door, they won't hear them either. Ned outlined the final phase. My climbers will reach the top. They will silently eliminate the rear sentries. They will take their cloaks and their armor to blend in the dark. In the chaos of your assault, they will cross the courtyard, reach the gatehouse from the inside, cut the counterweights for the portcullis, and open the heavy oak doors. When the gates swing open, Robert, you charge. The tent was silent. It was a brazen, desperate, bordering on insane plan. It relied entirely on the physical impossibility of men scaling a wet, freezing, sheer cliff face in the pitch dark. Robert looked at the map. He looked at the gatehouse that had thwarted him. Then he looked at Ned. A slow, feral grin spread across the king's face. You really have men who can climb that rock? Robert asked. I have wolves, Ned said simply. Robert grabbed his warhammer from the chair. He hoisted it onto his shoulder, the steel gleaming in the firelight. Lord Tywin, Stannis, Robert commanded, his voice filled with the terrible joy of impending violence. Rouse your men, feed them, arm them, tell the siege engineers to prepare every barrel of burning pitch we possess. He turned to his hand, his eyes wild with anticipation. John, tell that mad red priest. Thoros, tell him to coat his blade in wildfire and put him at the very front of the vanguard. If Balin wants a fire in the night, we'll give him a blazing comet. Make them think we are coming to burn them all to ash. He looked back at Ned, his blue eyes burning. Tonight, we make some noise. You get that gate open, Ned. I'll be waiting on the other side. Ned left the sweltering heat of the royal pavilion and walked briskly through the freezing mud toward the northern encampment. His command tent was sparse, lacking the tapestries and heavy furniture of the southern lords. It held only a map table, a few sturdy chairs, and weapon racks. He pushed through the flap. Benjen was already there, pacing nervously. Beside him stood Willem. Willem was no longer the starving orphan from the winter town. At 19, the captain of the Wolf Guard was a physical specimen forged from iron and discipline. He was lean, corded with dense muscle from years of Ned's grueling, brutal training regimens. He wore the signature blackened mail and gray cloak of his unit, moving with an eerie, silent stillness. You heard the king's command, Ned said, unbuckling his heavy wolfskin cloak and throwing it over a chair. We assault the gate tonight, Willem said, his voice flat, devoid of fear or excitement. It was the voice of a honed weapon. Robert assaults the gate, Ned corrected, stepping up to the map table. We open it. He looked at his brother and his captain. This is not a battle of shield walls, Benjen. This is a task of stealth. I need 20 men, the absolute best climbers in the guard. Men with grip strength that can crush stone and lungs that can burn for hours without failing. Every man in the Wolf Guard can climb that cliff, Lord Stark, Willem stated with absolute factual certainty. Years of doing weighted pull-ups on greased wooden beams until their hands bled had given them the upper body strength of mountain apes. But I will select the 20 who are the most silent. You will lead them, Willem, Ned said. But Benjen, you are in command of the ascent. Benjen straightened up, his gray eyes widening slightly. Me, Ned, I am a lord, shouldn't I be leading the vanguard with the heavy infantry? The vanguard will be a butcher's yard, Ned said bluntly. And I need someone I trust absolutely to make the critical commands inside those walls. The Wolf Guard are lethal, but they are instruments. They need a mind to guide them once they are behind enemy lines. Ned placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. You know the techniques, Benjen. You know how to anchor yourself. When you are on that cliff face, hanging by your fingertips over the freezing ocean, you will not panic. You will be immovable, that is why you must go. Benjen swallowed hard, looking at the map of the sheer cliffs. He nodded, the nervous energy settling into a cold, hard resolve. I understand, I will not fall, Ned. See that you don't, Ned smiled grimly. Daisy would never forgive me if I let you drop into the sea before the wedding. He turned back to the table, detailing the plan. You strip down, Ned ordered. No heavy plate, no chainmail, it makes noise and weighs you down. Boiled leather only, soft-soled climbing boots, bring iron pitons, rope, and chalk for your hands. Weapons, Willem asked. Short swords and daggers, Ned instructed. Nothing that catches on the rock. When you reach the top, the sea-facing sentries will be isolated. You do not engage in a duel. You eliminate them silently. Throat cuts, chokeholds, No shouting. Ned tapped the center of the keep on the map. Once the sentries are dead, you strip their cloaks and helms. You put them on. The courtyard will be chaos. Robert's attack will draw the garrison's attention to the front. You walk through the shadows, dressed as Ironborn, moving purposefully toward the gatehouse. If we are challenged, Benjen asked. You don't stop to chat, Ned said coldly. You kill whoever stops you and keep moving. Your only task is the winch room above the main gate. You cut the counterweight ropes. The portcullis will drop, but the heavy oak doors will be unlocked. You throw the locking beams, push the doors open, and get out of the way. The king's vanguard will do the rest. Willem offered a crisp, sharp nod. It will be done, Lord Stark. Select your men, Captain, Ned said. Rest them, feed them light. We move at the hour of the wolf. To be continued.